Welcome to the BoF Professional Summit, Closing Fashion Sustainability Gap. I'm Imran Ahmed, founder and CEO of the Business of Fashion. Over the coming 4 hours, we're going to dissect this vast and complex topic with a global group of sustainability experts to examine one of the fashion industry's most critical challenges. We only have 10 years to take action to avoid catastrophic climate change, and increasingly, values-driven consumers are losing patience with fashion's consistent failings when it comes to the welfare of the people who work across the industry and the impact of our industry on the environment. Investors and regulators are also sitting up and taking notice. As an industry, we have a responsibility to take action, both because of fashion's substantial impact, but also because of its outsized cultural influence and global visibility. What the fashion industry says and does can change behavior much more widely. You may have noticed that fashion companies are talking more about sustainability than ever before. But while the industry talks about sustainability, it remains challenging to really understand whether operating practices are changing quickly enough. Today, we will focus on how the industry should move forward. But first, we need to understand the magnitude of the challenge we're dealing with. Last month, we released the BoF Sustainability Index, benchmarking the performance of 15 of fashion's largest publicly traded companies across 3 industry segments: sportswear, luxury, and high street.
Fashion's biggest companies are talking about environmental and social responsibility more than ever before. But is anything actually changing? The BoF Sustainability Index tracks how the industry is progressing to avoid catastrophic climate change and reach broader social imperatives. The index examines 6 key areas where fashion needs to focus its efforts: waste, water and chemicals, workers' rights, materials, emissions, and transparency, and benchmarks how the industry's biggest companies measure up. While there are pockets of innovation and progress, across the board fashion is falling short and there is still much work to be done.
The BoF Sustainability Index is the culmination of more than 1 year of comprehensive research and analysis. This involved trawling through thousands of pages of documents, fact-checking and sense-checking thousands of data points in conversation with the companies and in consultation with an external council of sustainability experts to explore the 6 interconnected topics underlying the index: transparency, emissions, water and chemicals, materials, workers' rights, and waste. The goal was to create a sense of accountability against the industry's sustainability commitments, take stock of shortcomings, and establish a framework for where we go next. But before we dive into our talks with some of the most respected experts in sustainability, I'm joined by our own resident expert, London editor Sarah Kent, who led the research and data gathering on the index. So Sarah, about a year ago, you walked into my office. It was a physical office at that time, and you proposed this index. Why did the industry need an index like this in the first place?
Well, to be honest, Imran, it was selfish. I was covering sustainability in the industry, and I kept getting emails from really big companies telling me they were doing this thing or that thing. And I wanted to be able to understand both how that measured up against where we needed to get to, and also how the companies compared to each other. So I could see who was moving ahead, who was moving behind, and where we need to really get to. And it was very hard to find information on that. So it started from something that I wanted for myself. But when I started talking to people more widely, I realized actually this is a tool that could be really useful to the whole industry. And so naively, I thought, well, we could do this. And then we started doing it, and we realized why it hasn't existed so much before, because it's an incredible amount of work. But here we are.
So what made it so challenging to compile the index?
Well, first of all, we needed to think about where it is the industry needs to get to, because everyone at the moment is setting their own goals, sort of marking their own homework. And we wanted to create a series of benchmarks that were comparable. And so we went out and we convened a sustainability council of really respected experts, and we got them to help us think about what are the moonshot goals the industry should be reaching for. So that was the starting point. What are the targets? And then we had to go and try and figure out if the 15 companies we were looking at were anywhere close to meeting them. And to do that, we had to go through thousands of pages of documents. And these were public disclosures, but often the way they were written was very hard to decipher what was really meant. People would talk about the same topics using very different languages, or people make no disclosure at all. And those are obviously the easiest companies to mark or compare because there's not a lot to look at.
They're not saying anything, right?
So it's less time consuming, but it means there's not a lot to go on.
Okay, let's walk through each of the sections of the index. We're going to start with transparency. Talk to us about the transparency challenge and just a high-level overview of what you found.
Absolutely. So, transparency is absolutely foundational here. It's all about our companies measuring their impact, both from a social and environmental perspective. Do they know where things come from so that they can measure it? And then are they disclosing it so that people can hold them to account externally, consumers, regulators, investors, the press, but also they themselves can set smart and strategic goals. So it's absolutely fundamental when you're talking about sustainability. And as a result, for those at home who can see the slides at the moment, transparency is an area where the industry seems to be doing quite well. Companies are beginning to measure their impact. However, because it's so fundamental, when we thought about setting moonshot targets for the next 10 years, our targets suggest that these are goals the industry needs to be hitting next year. Right. So from that perspective, we're a little behind.
So I think the overall score was 48. And we have a year to close that gap.
Yeah,
okay.
So less than halfway there.
Okay, let's continue on to the next category, which is emissions.
Yes.
Emissions gets a lot of attention because of the greenhouse gas targets that everyone's thinking about for 2030. What's the role of fashion in this emissions situation?
Well, the industry is a massive polluter. It doesn't get thought about always in those terms because you think clothes, you don't necessarily think big industrial factories pumping out greenhouse gases, but the manufacturing supply chain is very emitting. And there are emissions throughout the whole of the rest of the industry too, but it's really in manufacturing where the bulk of the footprint takes place. And what we're seeing is that companies are getting engaged in the conversation that's going on globally. They are using internationally accepted frameworks to set smart targets that are science-based, that align them with global goals to limit climate change. And that's why you see them performing quite well. But then when you dig a little bit deeper and you try and get hold of data that shows that emissions are reducing, that's much harder to find. So we're just starting at where the industry needs to get to.
Okay, so transparency and emissions were two of the areas where the industry performed the best. There's still more work to do. Let's talk about water and chemicals, which is a huge part of the impact that fashion has on the environment.
Absolutely. So water and chemicals are an interesting one. When you look at how the companies we looked at performed in the index, it was middling within the spectrum of SMARCs we were seeing. There are some companies that are really pushing ahead, setting very sophisticated goals to reduce their water use and manage their water use. There are others that aren't engaging as much. Similarly, when it comes to chemicals, really all of the action that has taken place revolves around conversations that were started about 10 years ago because of a very successful Greenpeace campaign, but it's not getting as much attention as some of the other topics we're looking at right now. And it's an area where momentum really risks stalling if we don't keep an eye on it.
And that's interesting that you see progress historically because of the detox campaign by Greenpeace. It shows that some of these consumer and activist campaigns can really push companies
Absolutely.
to take action. So the next one I'd like to talk about is materials. Let's discuss materials. Obviously fashion is a very it's in an industry made up of physical objects. What's the materials impact
I mean, materials is fascinating. All of these topics interconnect, but materials really covers all of the issues that we've just talked about. We're talking about water use in cotton, or pesticide use in cotton, or toxic chemicals used in dyeing these materials, or emissions from turning oil into polyester. So you have to consider all of these things when you're thinking about materials, but it's also a space where there's a lot of quite exciting opportunity to look at things like regenerative agriculture, to not just reduce or mitigate fashion's impact, but actually try and ensure that materials we use in our clothes have a positive impact on the planet.
And we'll be touching on that point later in today's session. Workers' rights is front of mind right now. There's the ongoing situation in Xinjiang in China. We've been hearing stories throughout the pandemic from the BoF community in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in India, but also in Leicester here in the United Kingdom, in Los Angeles, about workers being bearing the brunt of this crisis and kind of breaking open the systemic inequality that exists in our supply chains.
Yeah, and you can see in the performance of companies in the index, this is not an area, despite the focus, despite decades of conversations around creating fairer supply chains, the industry is still failing. And really it comes down to the fact that the structure, the business model of fashion is not set up to support the people who make our clothes. It is set up to enrich big brands in the West. And we need to create a fairer, more balanced value chain that sort of distributes the wealth more evenly to fix this, really.
Okay. And finally, the lowest performing category, probably the biggest challenge this industry has to face, is around waste. And I think, you and I were talking about this, in the early part of 2020 before the pandemic, and this staggering number of 114 billion garments of clothing emerged. And it really kind of put in focus for me just how much excess product is produced and how short a time period consumers actually spend wearing the clothes. So talk to us about waste.
I mean, waste is so fascinating because it's just there are many elements to this, but it's a cost center. This is an inefficiency in the industry. And when you look at the volume of waste that's created, you think, how are these COOs, CFOs, how are they going to their boards and saying, well, we had to sell 50% of our product at discount, but it's okay. Why is that a business that we're okay with just from a financial perspective? And then when you get into the environmental impact, it really doesn't make sense. But at the same time, it's a huge opportunity because there's all of this cost saving that is tied up in operating the industry more efficiently. And there's a lot of really exciting innovations around recycling technologies that are going on right now. But it's also an area that companies talk about a lot more when they launch collections using recycled plastic or circular collections, much more than they're actually doing it. So we need to see that change urgently.
Okay. So Sarah, in sum, before you joined BoF about 2 years ago, you covered the oil and gas sector for the Wall Street Journal for almost a decade, maybe more than a decade. Oil and gas is another dirty sector. But if you look at all of the progress that has happened in oil and gas, how do you compare that to what's happening in fashion?
It's a really fascinating question because, especially when I first came over, I couldn't help but keep making comparisons between what it was like in sector I used to cover and what it's like here. I think one of the big things that has struck me is that both fashion and oil and gas have a huge dirty footprint, but because fashion isn't thought of that way, flies under the radar, it hasn't had the pressure for as long as the oil and gas industry. And also it has a almost more larger challenge in a way because it is not clear what the solution is for fashion. For oil and gas, you have an energy transition. You transition to renewables. What is renewable fashion? Right. That's something we have to figure out.
Yeah, well, we are going to take a look at all of these issues over the course of the next few hours. That's a comprehensive overview. So what can we do about it? We've convened a group of leading global experts to help answer our questions on each of the core categories that Sarah and I have just discussed. You'll hear from members of our Sustainability Council and other leading experts, followed by our closing keynote with Stella McCartney, a globally respected pioneer in the field of sustainable fashion. And most importantly, we want to hear from all of you, as your voices are an important part of the conversation. So remember, throughout the upcoming discussions, you can ask questions of our speakers using the tool next to the video player and join the conversation on social media using the hashtag BoF Professional. First up, we'll get into a challenge that also represents a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for the industry, as Sarah was just discussing, minimizing waste. Here's a little intro.
Waste. Fashion feeds a culture of wasteful overconsumption. As fashion trends move faster, consumers are buying more clothes and wearing them for shorter periods of time, leading to waste. Every year, roughly 40 million tons of textile waste is sent to landfill or incinerated. There are creative opportunities to turn fashion's trash piles into valuable resources. Alternative business models like resale and rental are only just beginning to get off the ground, with companies talking more about circularity than they are actually embracing it. And going forward, technological solutions such as waste repurposing and recycled material development need more investment.
We're going to move straight into our first session to explore a challenge in our industry that isn't just hurting the planet, but fundamentally damaging industry profitability. If you look at the piles of inventory that have built up over the course of the pandemic and the volume of clothes that sell at a discount every year. To talk about the solutions for this challenge, we're joined by BoF's chief correspondent, Lauren Sherman, who is up very early in Los Angeles, and Edwin Kay, based in Hong Kong. He is the CEO of the Hong Kong Research Institute of Textiles and Apparel, a research and development center which has developed exciting new technologies that could help to reshape the fashion industry. Edwin is also a valued member of our Sustainability Council. Over to you, Lauren.
Hi, Edwin. How are you?
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. So this is a very big topic. And I think what would be good to do is I want to talk about the specific work that you do. I think a lot of people in our audience are going to be fascinated and inspired by it. But first, can we talk about big picture? Waste means a lot of things in fashion. We think about excess inventory. We think of landfills filled with clothes, et cetera, but it affects every single part of the process of making a garment. Can you talk a bit about why it's such a problem or an issue and how it affects the entire fashion ecosystem?
Right. So you're right. It's a big topic, and the waste that we usually see or talk about, at least as consumers, is really the proverbial tip of the iceberg, right? That's the stuff that's left over. But if you think about all the byproducts that are created in the process of making your garment, the agricultural byproducts when you grow whatever material you're growing, or the petroleum byproducts if you're using a synthetic material, and then the water, the dye stuff that you use, and then you discharge to color the material, and then the cutting waste and all the stuff that's left on the floor of the factory, and then all the supporting packaging material, the plastic bags and the boxes and the cartons that are put in for transportation purposes. And then you have the garment itself, which if you look at sort of the gross weight or the net weight of it, is actually a fraction of all that stuff that has happened already. And then there is the useful life of the product, right? We used to hang on to clothes a lot longer. Now things have a much shorter useful life. We don't use it as often, and we dispose of it a lot faster. So then we come to the post-consumer portion of the materials that now have to be dealt with. But you're very right about talking about just that word waste. I mean, is it waste? Because all this stuff is they're all useful material and they all have value, but we call it waste just because we're discarding so many things.
You know, there's this stat that goes around, and I'm sure it'll be brought up a million times today, about how it's wrong that fashion is the second most polluting industry or something like that, that there's no, there's not a real, is there any way to measure how much waste the industry actually is making, or as you said, excess? Because I think you're right that we as humans, we want to kind of clean everything up and clear it and act like it didn't exist, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any value. But is there any way to measure the impact of all this excess material that we have at the beginning, middle, and end of these processes?
Well, that's all part of the problem too. There really has, or at least I haven't seen a scientific, more precise way of looking at what exactly we're consuming and how much resource in terms of material, energy, water, all this that we're consuming in the process of making these products. And so that's why you have these great disagreements or these wildly varying numbers about what exactly is going on, because there isn't anything going on. There isn't any precise measurement. And I think one of the reasons for that is that our rate of consumption of apparel, garments, and the materials for it has been going up so rapidly in the last decade or two, that once upon a time, it really was not that big of an issue. It just wasn't something that it is too trivial almost for us to measure, because we just hang on to stuff. But now we have we've changed our attitude and our relationship with our apparel. It went from a durable to a disposable or a consumable, and then all this waste began to appear.
I'd love to kind of dig deep into the topic of recycled materials, because that's something that you have been studying and working on and making progress on for many years now. And when I think when a lot of consumers think about, yes, we see recycled cotton occasionally at a big box retailer now, and they have lots of marketing around it. It's very exciting. Or organic cotton, if it's organic and recycled, even better. But when I think of something like a recycled material, I'm thinking of something that maybe doesn't have a great hand feel, that is textured and has a lot of blemishes or what have you. Can you talk a bit about the work that you've been doing to specifically improve recycled material, the kind of machines developed, and the kind of work you've done with bigger businesses on using these types of materials, and why it's so important?
Well, there's when we talk about recycled materials, there's every stage of that manufacturing process. There are opportunities to pick up materials that we're not using today or discarding today and use them. So there is industrial waste, and there is post-consumer waste, if you will. So there are lots of materials there. So that's one challenge, is kind of defining where it's coming from and what it is exactly. Two, I think when we talk about recycling today, we really are trying to deal with a problem that somebody else created some time ago. And we're sort of trying to retrofit a solution into a problem that appeared. And the way the reason why I think about it that way is first of all, fundamentally today, if you look at our fashion apparel supply chain, it is still linear in shape. We make stuff, we use stuff, and we want it to go away, and we take new material and we repeat that process. but not built into that process is that circularity or that the design intent for it to be recycled and reused in the first place. So we have that challenge, which is fundamentally we have this one-way direction of our supply chain, and then secondly, in terms of how apparel is built today, a lot of apparel is built without thinking about how am I going to reuse this? How am I going to dismantle it so that I can make something else out of it? And so what happens is that we make it very difficult for things to be recycled because it's blended, because it is put together in a way that, with other mixed materials or assembled in a way that it is very difficult to break apart. So those create challenges for us. I go back to this idea of durables and consumables. Once upon a time, we don't have to think about that because we tend to hang on to our clothes for a really, really long time, and so it doesn't lend itself to be a big problem. Why recycling has become more and more of an opportunity for us is because we aren't thinking of our apparel as durable. We are throwing things away, and because we have these ever more and more rapid cycles of fashion, and these cycles of fashions are shorter than the useful life of the material that our apparel are made from, and so it creates this opportunity for us to think about recycling.
So what are you doing specifically? Can you talk a bit about the work that you've done with the H&M group? Because I think that's a really unique project, and these machines that have been developed, if a business like Monkey can use them, does that mean that every scaled business could use them?
Right. We work specifically with the H&M Foundation, or the H&M Foundation came to us about 6 years ago. And we have had a research partnership with them. They are by no means the only brand that we have partnership and research partnerships with. We also work with other brands, but they certainly have been the most interested in looking at recycling. So for the last 5 years, our first series of projects with them is around recycling and specifically recycling methodology. And what we want to do is to look at it a lot more holistically. We are an applied research center, but when we look at something like a challenge of recycling, you can't look at it out of context. If you solve the science problem and you don't make the business case for it, or you don't create the logistics for it, then you have sort of like a half-baked solution that makes you feel good or works well in the lab, but doesn't have a real world application. So we have been looking at, first of all, just what are the different methods of recycling, and is there a business case that we can make with one of them? So we look at mechanical recycling, which you mentioned earlier. Hey, look, you end up paying more money for something that is not as comfortable, and you have to compromise on some of the aesthetics. Then we looked at biological systems, and we're still on that. We're using fermentation and different enzymes to separate, break down, and transform materials into either separating them or transforming them into other useful materials that we can reuse for garment applications. So that work is ongoing. And then we looked at chemical recycling, which in recent years have become quite a domain that there's a lot of interest. A lot of people see that chemical recycling as with the highest opportunity for developing some useful, efficient recycling methods. And we went down that road for about 3 years, but we kept coming up with the problem of creating new problems when we solve an old problem, which is we create a chemical waste stream that we now have to deal with. And so we said, well, that probably shouldn't be, that's not a very elegant solution. Is there something that works better? And so we started taking chemistry out of our chemical recycling efforts. And so we ended up with this breakthrough that we announced about 24 months ago, called the hydrothermal system, which is using heat and pressure to separate blended material and recover from it useful material, which are without any deterioration to the look, the hand feel, or the characteristic of the material. And at the same time, new useful raw materials for other types of new yarns and fibers that we can reuse again. And I can go on. There's a lot of interesting byproducts that came out of that, but that's sort of one group of experiments that we're very excited about.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And when you talk about the business case, how much more expensive is it for a company to use the kind of methods that you're using versus just buying new fabric? And if it is more expensive, how do you kind of explain to them the reason for doing it?
Yeah. And that's always been the challenge, right? We are using recycled materials out of the goodness of our heart, if you will, not because it's more comfortable or cheaper. And so we want to solve that. We don't want people to use recycled material out of the goodness of their heart. And so hence why we're excited about this. So first of all, we are almost at par in terms of the cost for comparable material, virgin to recycle on the polyester side. So the Monkey collection is the first one out of this. And we have scaled it from a small pre-industrial scale system, about 150 kilos a day, which is what we're operating right now, to a 1.5 ton to 2 ton a day system, an industrial scale system, which is as soon as we can get visas in the era of the pandemic that we're in, we would be installing in a manufacturing facility, and it will go live and start producing live materials. And if we don't label it, as a consumer, if you pick up the garment, you will not know the difference. On the polyester side, whatever materials that go in to be treated in the hydrothermal system comes out in exactly the same state. There's no mechanical, there's no deterioration in performance, there's no difference in hand feel. And we have gotten the cost of that down to incremental difference. And this was, and so we started this industrial scale project in December of 2019. And with the pandemic delays, we're on the cusp of turning this thing on. And we think this is a tremendous scale up opportunity. But then we have been creating this series of other useful outputs with this that we are also very excited. We have on the natural material, on the cellulosic side material, we have developed a new type of viscose material. We have been able to use the cellulosic material to develop a PFC-free water repellent treatment so the PFC-free DWR treatment is the geek term. And then also we announced last November a successful first experiment to use the cellulosic material, which we functionalized into a new polymer as a way to grow cotton without irrigation. So that is being scaled up, and we are looking at irrigation-free cotton. We're also adding more functionality to these recycled cellulosic particles so that it has nutrients in it, so we don't have to add fertilizer. And we're looking at sort of like a beyond organic type of cotton, which grows faster, yields more per acre, and has longer fibers. So all sort of, we're very excited, and we think that there's a lot of opportunities. And all of this is to make the business case for this, so that we recycle because it's not only, it's a do well, do good type of a business proposition.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk. I'm so interested if the industry just skips over organic cotton and goes straight to your solution, but that's probably another conversation. Before we open to questions, I do want to ask you about the consumer's behavior. You mentioned that the Monkey Project, there's not going to be it's not going to be labeled or what have you with recycled materials. I think this is something that, you know, it's very difficult if you do a survey and you ask consumers, yes, I would like my products to be, I want to buy less and save more or what have you, and I want to wear my clothes forever, I want to invest. They'll all say that they want to do that. The way that people act and the way their intentions are often very different. But I'm curious to know from you, especially over the last year and a half, how has consumer behavior changed, and how do you see that, like talking about the business imperative of these sorts of changes in the operating model? How has the consumer's behavior changed, do you think, permanently, and what does that have to do with the work that you're doing and the work to make the industry more circular?
Right. Let me speak about that in more general terms, about the consumer, how the consumer has changed, especially through the pandemic. One of the things that we observed is that consumers are now much more engaged. I think you're right. There is still an inconsistency with what consumers say and what they do, how they spend, how they consume. And I don't really, the onus is not so much on the consumer. I don't think we as an industry have done a very good job at giving point of sale information that is helpful to consumers to make consumption decisions about, hey, if you buy product A versus product B, here is the carbon footprint, here's what you're doing, and here's how you can make a difference. We don't have that. We don't have the nutrition label, if you will, of the products that we sell. And so it's on us to be better at working on that communication. Consumers through the pandemic have a changed relationship with the garments. Garments are now more functional than they're aesthetic. Consumers want to make a difference with how they consume. You can see it by the logos that they want on their chest to speak about how that aligns with their value system. And so, and I think the other interesting change is that consumers that we have seen or that we have talked to want to be a lot more active. They want to be part of the solution. They don't want to just be a victim or a bystander of what is going around. So the connection between personal health and the health of the planet is something that is very powerfully brought to light with the pandemic. What happens to you and what happens to your community, it's kind of sort of an extension of the same thing. So we think this is really good. This would really there is that will. So how can we support that by giving the tools and by giving the options to the consumer as well too. And I'll also add that today, just by saying that, oh, we have recycled content, we're kind of green as a brand, it you don't stick out from the crowd. Everybody has something like that. You now the demand from the consumer, expectation for consumers are also higher. You have to be not only not one of the bad guys, you have to be one of the good guys. Right. So what are you doing for climate change? What are you doing to be carbon negative? What are you doing so that you can be much more regenerative or supporting biodiversity? I think all those are now front and center questions for the industry.
And how much does discounting culture and in the last year and a half, a lot of very, very large apparel retailers have really dialed back on discounting. Many at the high end, but also at the middle, have increased their prices. In the middle, a lot of them by 25%, what have you. They're talking a lot about less promotion. In the US, that's a huge, huge issue, but in Europe and I think in Asia as well, increasingly, how does the discounting culture and the attempt to pull away from that factor into this circularity? Why do businesses need to do that in order to get away from discount?
Yeah, yeah. And that also, by the way, going back to your original first question, that also is waste, right? Stuff that you make that nobody wants to buy. And I think that the challenge in that the pandemic also put a spotlight on is that we are in a fast changing dynamic marketplace globally. And so it is getting harder and harder to predict consumer demand using the existing models and working in the calendars that we have been working to. Consumers are much more, they really want things to be relevant and useful, and they really want these products to track with their lifestyle changes. So in the pandemic, it's quite obviously that comfort over aesthetics and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity to work on more intelligent ways to do analytics and to do predictives with consumers. And so that's another a great opportunity not to make a mistake in the first place.
Yeah. So we have time for one question, and quite a few people in the audience, including Sarah from Chicago and some other people have mentioned this. Policy, government framework, how important is it in terms of regulating this stuff that different governments that produce a lot of product or countries that consume a lot of product create some sort of policy to help move these initiatives through and make change?
I think it's a combination of government leadership, political leadership, and then creating the incentives, the tax and the pricing incentives. And that's where you start. But I think then the industry will have to take a lot of initiative then to drive that into the way we do business. I think fundamentally, one way to look at the issue with waste is that we are mispricing the materials that we use. We're just not holding users accountable to the total cost of using and disposing of this material. So we need to do a lot of that. But very soon thereafter, I think business purpose and business values will have to follow through. That we have to be an industry for good and a business that is supportive of a much more healthy marketplace.
Edwin, thank you so much. I could talk to you for another 2 hours. Really appreciate it. And Imran and Sarah, back to you.
Thank you, Lauren and Edwin, for that fascinating conversation. A lot to learn. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this short break to explore our next topic, water and chemicals.
Welcome back to the BoF Professional Summit, Closing Fashion Sustainability Gap. In this session, we'll dive deeper into the issues and look at how fashion can solve its pollution problems related to water and chemicals use. Here's a video with some more details.
Water and chemicals. Fashion is a thirsty and dirty industry, and momentum to eliminate hazardous chemicals and reduce water pollution is stalling. Producing raw materials like cotton and manufacturing fabrics and clothes can require high volumes of water and hazardous and toxic chemicals, contributing to pollution, drought, and desertification. Fashion companies need a more sophisticated approach to water and chemicals, including context-based water targets and a real understanding of their chemical footprint. This will help focus research into cleaner, greener chemistry and more water-efficient production.
Hello. I'm delighted to be joined here today with a panel of global experts to discuss this important topic. With me is Boma Brown-West, who leads efforts to eliminate toxic chemicals from consumer products in her role as Director of Safe and Healthy Products at advocacy group, the Environmental Defense Fund. And she's also a key member of our Sustainability Council. She's joined from Singapore by another council member, Dawn McGregor, who leads think tank China Water Risks work to help businesses navigate water and climate risks. And joining us from LA is Sanjeev Bal, Chief Executive at Cytex, a denim manufacturer known for its sustainable practices. And please don't forget that you guys can ask questions too. Throw them in the box and I will look at them at the end of our conversation and we can discuss those too. So Boma, Sanjeev, Dawn, thank you so much for joining me from all across the globe. I know that I've had such fascinating conversations with all three of you on this subject, which I think is one that can feel very technical. And it's also a subject that was much more in the public dialogue about a decade ago because of a very successful campaign that Greenpeace put in place called Calling on Fashion to Detoxify. So I wanted to start by really taking a step back a little bit and talking about what may have changed, what may not have changed, whether we've made any progress in the last decade at all. And Boma, I wanted to start with you because I know this is something that you're very engaged with in your work to promote cleaner and safer products. How substantial is the fashion and beauty industry's use of hazardous chemicals and how big is its contribution to pollution?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Happy to be here on this panel. Recently, I think just last year, the UN Environment Program put out its latest global chemical outlook and said that there's still millions of tons of synthetic chemicals out in the global environment. And that, consumerism, the production of products is really a big part of that. And according to WRI, about 20% of industrial water pollution is coming from garment manufacturing, coming from the fashion industry. And so fashion certainly has a large role in our overall chemical pollution problem. And so, yes, as you said, there is a lot of energy and activity and awareness about this over 10 years ago. And I think what was very, telling about the BoF Sustainability Index is that there's still so much more left to be done with respect to eliminating toxic chemicals from this industry.
Absolutely. And, Dawn, I know you've done a lot of work with a particular focus on China, talking to manufacturers there, surveying them and what they may be doing. How serious is this problem when you've kind of been measuring it and talking to manufacturers?
Sure, definitely a huge issue in China. So much is still made in China. And actually within the industry there, they use thousands and thousands of different chemicals just within the fashion industry. And when I did do that survey, it was over 80 plus Chinese textile manufacturers. It was to determine what their challenges were around going green, chemicals, water, and so on. And actually one of the three things that was identified from this survey was they need help on chemicals. A lot of brands and stuff, they would say, we want to use green chemicals. But how do you substitute what chemicals? It's not as simple as to say you just buy the, cleaner, greener chemicals. What are they? They're more expensive. Are you going to pay for it? And also the treatment of those chemicals, to make sure they're actually treated properly. It requires a lot to go into it. And it's definitely an area that needs a lot more work, as Boma said. A lot's been done, but a lot needs to still happen.
Right. So we have this pretty fundamental issue. And Sanjeev, you are a manufacturer. You run a denim factory, both in Vietnam and in LA. You have tried to make it as sustainable as possible. How are you dealing with these issues?
Well, I think first of all, there are some real risks involved which faces humanity in more than one way. And water by itself is not only scarce, but it's also creating massive negative impacts on our oceans, considering the recklessness that industry operates at today. Having said that, I think it's a personal responsibility for business because of the lack of legislation to ensure that we leave this planet in a much better place than where it is. I think at Cytex, what we have been really mindful of from day one is to be respectful to water because of all the issues that surround it. And what we've done is we basically invested into three critical areas. The first is infrastructure. The second is green chemistry. And the third are material sciences. It's an interesting combination which not only allows us to reduce the usage of water, but also allows us to be a zero discharge facility and keeps us in line with our philosophy that water is a very scarce resource.
So there are actually things, there are solutions out there, but I think there are two specific things you mentioned there, Sanjeev, that I wanted to pick up on. The first being investment and cost. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about what it takes financially and how big a barrier you think it is that we do need to spend money to make these changes.
Well, first of all, the first barrier is the migratory nature of our business and the lack of impact CapEx.
And by migratory, you mean that companies or brands will just move their manufacturing business elsewhere if prices go up?
Yes, it's a very insecure industry if you really look at it closely. You could lose business to another geography in nanoseconds. So it does not really motivate people to make long-term investments. So that's the first. And like I mentioned, there's no real availability for large CapEx to make, production facilities robust. Now, on the cost side, I believe it's a myth because we have experienced profitability. Now, to experience profitability is a better conversation than to have this cost conversation. So you have to shift gears from thinking short-term to having a mindset for long-term value creation. Once you walk on that path, what entrepreneurs will find is that actually to get water into your factory, it costs. For us, it costs 60 cents or 80 cents a cubic meter for every drop that we take into our factory, and another 60 cents a cubic meter for every drop that we put outside a factory because it needs to be cleaned up. The other side on cost is the sludge, which is, a huge contaminant. Now, if you measure these costs versus investing into a zero discharge wastewater treatment plant with a recycling facility, what we've experienced is we've broken even in 6 to 7 years. So other than that, you have to make long-term investments into technology, which can work with reduced chemicals and reduced water. And of course, at the end of the day, you have to push the limits to build product which is waterless. So all these need, mindset and long-term investments. And if people have the will, there is a way.
And I think that's a really interesting point, this idea of long-term investments. And also, I think there's an element of partnership here. Dawn, you have sort of acted in some ways as a go-between at points between big companies and manufacturers, presenting your findings to the larger companies to try and incentivize them to think more long-term in this way. How are you finding that conversation play out?
So when you get the official feedback from the brand, it's always this issue. And I agree with Sanjeev, it is a bit of a myth, but it's somehow still this stumbling block for the fashion industry around pricing. Who's going to pay for it? And in that survey, I did over 50% of the manufacturers I surveyed invested more than 2 million RMB, around 300,000 US dollars. And that wasn't just to be clean or green. It was because the domestic regulations are changing China is seriously cleaning up. It's got the most stringent environmental law globally. Yes, there's still issues around enforcement and lots to still be done, but that strong backbone is there. And with the increased enforcement and this regulatory shift, the factories have to be clean. They have to manage their water. They have to get their water quotas, pay for the treatment, and be tested. And so when you talk to the brands, more of the people I know within them, they're like, this is some great data. I can take it, I can run it up the pole, and this should hopefully get us moving. But somehow there's still a lot that has to happen. And what I would hope would have shown that there was this goal convergence with brands saying, we want to be clean, we want to be green, and making all these commitments. And then China having the Chinese producers that are having to meet these new higher regulatory requirements. So not to be just to look good, but they actually have to meet these requirements, really high stringent industry standards around dyeing, water use. So it was this goal convergence. And I thought this could be a real opportunity for the brands to change their trajectory, to really push and be cleaner. But it still comes down to price. And then it's also now price of labor and all of these other issues coming in, which yes, complicates it, but still seems a mismatch.
Yeah, and it's a really long-standing conversation. And that was the other aspect of what you said, Sanjeev, that I wanted to come back to, was the regulatory piece. BOMA, I know that, you're based in DC, the regulatory side of things is something you're very focused on. Where do you, Dawn mentioned that there's a lot of movement that has happened in China. Where do you see regulations falling in the US and the West here?
They certainly have an important role to play as well, right? We're not going to solve all of this just from corporate voluntary leadership. That is absolutely important, and we need it, but we also need government oversight that really prioritizes the environmental impacts of modern business. I think there's certainly more of a role that can be played. We haven't really seen that much activity yet, although I will see where it's really happening, especially in the United States, is on some of the environmental pollution that's happening within the US that can be traced back to certain industries. But there is, I think one of the key elements here is around, because we keep talking about price, but when we think about, environment too, there is already a human health and environmental price that is being paid. It's just been shifted, right? It's been shifted in terms of falling mainly on the factory workers, and the communities in which they live. And it's a generational price that's not just affecting, the people of today, but their children and their children's children, and essentially the ability of their communities to be able to thrive. And so I think one critical element here is really building in and accounting for the cost that's already happening today, tying it more to the financials of these large brands and retailers.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and I think it's one that we'll return to again and again throughout the course of today's summit. It's how do we account for the price of something, and are we really understanding what the cost of things are? And as you said, we're really not. I think one thing I'm curious to ask you a bit more about, BoMA, which I know we've discussed before, when we think about how we would account for this better, how fundamental a challenge is the fact that really across the fashion industry, broadly speaking, there's not a very good understanding of what the chemical formulas being used are, and how fundamental is that as an issue that needs to be solved pretty urgently?
Oh, it's very fundamental. You don't know where to start or how to fix something unless you have a very strong and accurate baseline of where you are today. There certainly has been a lot of very helpful collaboration and work to build this fundamental baseline. There are, at this point, there are over 100 or almost 160 organizations that are part of the ZDHC, which has really tried to lay out these consistent guidelines, one harmonized materials or manufacturing restricted substance list, or an MRSL for companies to follow, and a candidate list along with that, trying to create this platform that everyone in the industry can go to find better chemistries. And so there has been a lot of that effort to help companies build their inventory, their chemical inventories in a consistent way and be able to assess it. And what we need to see now is what's the positive result of that? What's the uptake of all of these things? Are companies actually setting goals and meeting those goals with respect to having that better understanding of their own chemical footprint and that of the rest of their supply chain? Have they identified the places, the particular chemicals that they're using the most in their own products? And are they actually making concrete reductions in those spaces? But unless you actually have that first data in hand of where you're starting, what is in use throughout your supply chain, you can't then really take that action to reduce.
Right. How can we fix an issue we don't really fully understand yet?
Exactly.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to have a look at some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. We have one here, which is on whether there are any solutions, and Sanjeev, I'm curious if you've come across this, any solutions that exist to mitigate impact once chemicals have been released into the environment, or is it really more about putting in place better water recycling technology to ensure that pollution doesn't get out in the first place?
Right. So this is a constant conversation that I've had with a lot of people. It's about, what do you put first, the cart or the horse, right? So if you go with that traditional mentality, oops, there's going to be pollution, how do we stop it from going out? I think that's a very traditional conversation. We have to shift gears, and we have to talk about technology and green chemistry. So, this reminds me of a Nokia phone I had 30 years ago. I don't have it anymore, right? So if businesses don't evolve into the technological space that is available to all today, it's not like we're inventing stuff. The progressive mentality will not set in. For example, why are we even talking about chemicals here? I don't understand it. The future is about material sciences. So for example, not that I'm touting anything here, but we just built a fabric mill. But the fabric mill is built for purpose, right? So if the material requires less work to get the desired output, there is very little impact that you could put onto that end product in terms of either chemicals or even water. The two chemicals for us in our business, especially in the denim space, are three, I would say, two chemicals and an ingredient, which are really, really harmful. One is the consistent use of bleach. The second is the consistent use of potassium permanganate. And I'm really surprised this is not being banned. Somebody has to ban this stuff. And the third is the usage of stones, which are silica, embedded. So today we operate our manufacturing facility for the most of the better part without bleach, without potassium permanganate, and without stones, right? So if you eliminate the hazardous substances that go behind chemistry, right, for desired output, well, you're not talking about hazardous chemicals anymore, right? So I'll give a classic example. We built our LA factory to purpose. The goal was we set up a recycling plant for the first time inside the factory. And it's like a micro little recycling plant, but it comes with a lot of constraints. You can recycle 98%, but the constraint, number one constraint, you cannot use potassium permanganate. Number two, you cannot use bleach. And number three, you cannot use stones. but the product that we are making in LA is good as anywhere else in the world right now to premium clients. So we've managed to deliver a brand new chemistry, right, which kind of allows us to also stay competitive, because you have to realize that these things cost less. So when you're in an advanced economy like the US and you want to bring manufacturing back, the technology and the chemistry both have to sink in. If these two are not glued together, then we're just continuing to have these traditional cost and traditional pollution and all these conversations that people keep. I mean, we've been hearing of this for the past 10 years, right? Nonstop. And, for me, I think people just have to grow up.
But I think that's really interesting because it points to both the risks for those companies that don't get ahead of this, but also the opportunities that are out there to not just mitigate the issues, but innovate to find real positive solutions. Got another question here from Stephen Luckoff asking, and Boma, perhaps this is one that you're most likely to have heard about, asking about the upcoming 2023 US Farm Bill, whether you are aware of any imminent policies that are necessary that should be coordinated to catalyze regenerative farming, driving a reduction in sort of hazardous chemicals use even further down the supply chain. Is that something that you're plugged into at all, Boma?
No, some of my colleagues are definitely, but not me directly.
I think probably something that we have to circle back on, but definitely an interesting question to raise. Another question here from Wesley Robinson. Is there a system for the processes involving water consumption that could integrate with other circular techniques and create truly circular garments? A bit like what you were talking about earlier, Sanjeev, in terms of innovative processes. But how do you see this conversation playing into the conversation around circularity? Because recycling is often actually quite a chemical intensive process. So is that another issue that we haven't addressed that we need to think about?
Right. So there are solutions there as well. So there are different levels of upcycling. I don't call it recycling. So there is technology in place today to, to shred and to refurbish. I call it refurbishment, and to build, a brand new yarn. Of course, you do have to add in virgin material into it today to give it the strength that it demands. It's not like you can take something, you can take a pair of jeans and say, well, I just made brand new fabric out of this. That doesn't exist. But when you talk about recycling or upcycling and the whole mentality of circularity, I think there's an opportunity here in terms of not necessarily just making fabric again, right? Why do you need to go back to making more of what there is already enough, or more than enough, right? So let's say you have waste material, be it fabric or post-consumer waste in terms of garments or pre-consumer waste, whatever it may be. We've set up an upcycling facility in Thailand where we have the ability to crush waste textiles into nanoparticles and convert it into a product which is a substitute for wood. And today we're making flooring, facades, furniture, you name it. So there are other applications that encourage people to go after versus trying to recirculate the same problem all over again.
Dawn, I'm curious, you mentioned the strict regulations in China. Are you seeing more of these kind of technological innovations being picked up within the manufacturing base within China? Or is that still a wide open opportunity?
There's definitely been an uptake, but it's still pretty open because they're having to invest themselves in the technology and then the know-how of how to implement, upgrade, and use it, which isn't that simple. So it's looking for more about partnership again. And so
right,
there's
exactly.
that opportunity still. Yep, for sure.
Right. So we're low on time here, but I think that's a really nice point to end on, coming back to this idea that, as Sanjeev points out, the opportunities are out there, but it's not enough to simply have regulation in place to require change. There needs to be more incentives and partnership to ensure that investment takes place for the future. I think that's given us all a lot to think about. Boma, Dawn, Sanjeev, Thank you so much for such an amazing conversation. Look forward to speaking to you all again soon. And we will be right back with a very important conversation on workers' rights right after this break.
Welcome back to the BoF Professional Summit. Now we'll get into a problem that fashion just can't seem to get right: labor rights. From forced Uyghur labor in the Xinjiang region in China to Los Angeles, USA, and here in the UK in Leicester, fashion brands have had to face growing calls to address atrocious labor conditions in their supply chains.
Workers' rights. The fashion industry runs on systemic inequality and social injustice. The modern, mass-market, speed-obsessed, and globalized fashion system has created convoluted and unequal supply chains plagued by labor abuses, only made worse by the coronavirus pandemic. Fashion needs a new social contract that gives power to workers' voices, advocates for more robust labor regulation, and ensures purchasing practices support equitable working conditions and living wages.
So to explore this vital topic, Sarah spoke to a group of leading experts to address issues around workers' rights in fashion supply chains from different perspectives. Ananya Bhattacharjee is based in Bangalore, India, and is international coordinator at the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, a group of trade unions and labor right activists focusing on addressing poverty wages, gender discrimination, and promoting freedom of association for garment workers in the region. Based in Los Angeles, Aisha Barenblatt is the founder and chief executive of Remake, the advocacy group behind the Pay Up campaign, which highlighted brands that refused to pay for completed orders when the pandemic hit. And Ritu Sethi is an expert on South Asia's traditional arts, crafts, and textiles, and their practitioners, and is based in New Delhi. She's the founder trustee of Craft Revival Trust, and editor of the global international journal Intangible Cultural Heritage. A few days ago, Sarah sat down with this group just as the H&M company was facing a backlash about its position on Xinjiang cotton.
Before we dive into what the industry needs to do to tackle so many of these labor issues, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're still facing systemic problems of labor abuse. And Ananya, I wondered if I could start with you. You know, you spent your career advocating to try and fix these issues. Why is fashion still failing to protect its workers?
Well, fast fashion industry, or one can say really fashion industry as a whole, because even when they're not fast fashion, they're mimicking the fast fashion business model. The fashion industry business model is really at the heart of the problem. And so till that business model changes, we are unlikely to see fundamental changes. And this business model, as we know, is the model of the global supply chain, where the supply chain is driven by multinationals who are not accountable within any legal jurisdiction. And they have basically covered themselves, protected themselves from liability and responsibility by just stepping outside of national jurisdictions and pretending like the supplier factories are just there making stuff and they're just buying from them. So it's a very sort of, a distant relationship, and not really admitting to the fact that they are responsible for all the working conditions in the supplier factories, because they are supremely involved in the production process and all that goes along with the production process, which means workers' wages, their production targets, how fast they have to work, how cheaply they have to work, and so on and so forth. So this business model is really a problematic one where the multinationals are well protected.
And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that this isn't just a fast fashion problem, because Ritu, I know you work very closely with craftspeople, with artisans who work on the luxury market. Do you see the same thing playing out at a luxury level?
Well, that is what is really interesting, because you speak to craftspeople, you speak to Karigar, and you find out that they are embroidering, weaving, block printing for some of the largest luxury companies in the world. And yet, when you see the label, it has nothing to do with India. And this actually is because in India, we have the largest number of makers and highly skilled makers who weave, who embroider, and they know exactly where their product is going, but they are the hidden end of the chain, poorly paid. And before this, I was just talking to some of them. And in fact, one of them said, we are their invisible chefs. And I think COVID-19 has really brought it to the forefront. And what it has brought to the forefront is because they were invisible, they suffered greatly in this time, because work that they had in hand was canceled, not picked up, orders, raw material in-house, and salaries just cut, payments just cut, and most of the work is job work. So it is a per piece rate, irrespective of how much work has gone into it. So it is a dismal situation, but I feel that at this point in time, that for the first time, we have really taken a pause. And at least in India, when we saw those hundreds and millions of skilled people, and I hate using the word migrants, they were skilled workers, skilled karigars, left without salary, left without wages, without food, who walked home. I have a feeling that this is our opportunity. This is our opportunity to make visible, and I think being stuck at home has also made us more people-centric and more conscious of human connections. So I hope this is the time. I hope Ananya will find some hope in this situation where we can make some kind of change and some conscious, mindful change.
I think that's such a valuable point, because having this topic be top of mind at the moment is so important, because for a long time it was, I think, superseded by sustainability conversations that focused on environmental impact, certainly in the last few years. And Aisha, I know you have been really at the forefront of efforts, within the Western market to get people talking about it, to build consumer awareness. And I'm curious if you share this optimism. And also, I think it's important, and Aisha, I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this, to note that this is really an international issue. These issues are the same in LA as they are in India.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just so struck, Sarah, by the fact that you have 3 South Asians on this panel, Ananya, Ritu, and myself. I grew up, as you know, in Pakistan, and, we were all one country. And I really do think that the fact that all of us have spent our career fighting for the makers, the high-skilled people who essentially are hidden from the consciousness of customers and citizens, is because we see ourselves in their narrative and we care in a fundamentally different way. And so much of Remake Story is rebuilding that empathy and connection with Western customers. Because as Ritu said, the faster and cheaper our clothes have been coming to us, the more fragmented supply chains have gotten, the more she is essentially hidden from our consciousness. And you know this, Sarah, I always say she because predominantly, whether artisan or sitting in factories, it's women of color who make our clothes and bring our fashion to life. Most Western customers have no understanding. So much of the work that we do in high schools and universities and educating everyday young women who care so very much about gender justice don't even recognize that the actual makers of their clothes are women in their early 20s. And so I am, much like Ritu, very hopeful. Hopeful because in the last year, we as the people behind the Pay Up campaign were simply astonished by the awakening of the South Asian diaspora, first and foremost, but really of citizens and workers locking arms in solidarity to say, this is not right. You as fashion brands have the money, you are to pay up. You are not to shore your own balance sheets at the cost of Black and brown women. I also am very hopeful because we're starting to finally see some political will. Whether you think about the call for having someone adjudicate in Leicester, the Garment Worker Protection Act right here in California that would eliminate the piece rate system, the conversations around mandatory human rights due diligence coming out of Germany. Because here's the thing, it's a $2.6 trillion industry. It's completely deregulated, and it's deregulated by design. And we know that the industry is not going to guard itself because for too long they have dehumanized this workforce, treated the makers of their clothes as a cost center rather than an asset. And without smart regulation, without actually assuring that the very people who bring this product to life are paid fairly, we're going to get nowhere. Because the business model, whether luxury or mass market, is set to exploit people. We saw this era in the sustainability index of business of fashion, right? The luxury brands and the high street brands did just as badly when it comes to worker rights. So it turns out that regardless of what you sell to the end customer, the people at the other end of the supply chain are paid no better.
Can I just add to what Aisha said?
Yeah.
Because actually what surprises me is the short-sightedness involved. Because at the end of the day, strategic thinking for a company of any size, any size and anywhere, and is not about the color, the trend, and the style and the cut. It's about listening to the consumer and being future ready. And if you don't listen, the voices are changing. There is a call for change. And consumers are talking about it. Any designer interview I read now, they start by first saying, oh, we paid all our employees. We didn't cut any salaries. We continued through the lockdown. That is how it all starts. So people at the head of these large corporations need to start listening. Because now the digital footprint, we have gone digital. In India, 90% of the country is covered by digital. A smartphone costs 5,000 rupees. Everybody is on WhatsApp and another social media. All you need is a tweet, an Instagram post, and before you know it, the myth making, the storytelling is in trouble. So it calls for thinking at that level. And it's good business to be good to your employees, to your makers, to the practitioners, right down to tier 3 and 4 of your supply chain.
I so agree with you, Ritu. And as I think about the racial reckoning that's happened here in the United States, the conversation of colonization and the history of fashion in the UK, you are seeing a different customer that is starting to understand the connections between these issues. They're done with the fashion brands' antics around, performative posts. This week we really are standing in solidarity with stopping Asian hate. Last summer, it was we are really fighting, in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And, the customers are savvy enough to say, look, one Instagram post and you're not going to get away with it. Your supply chain is predominantly built on profiting off the backs of Asian, brown, and Black people. So don't pretend that you care about what's happening here when the very structures that are baked into your supply chain perpetuate a lot of this racism and gender-based violence. And, I do think that it is a business imperative, and COVID has certainly shown us that supply chain resilience in itself is at stake. We've seen so many supply chain ruptures, from Myanmar to what's happening with the cotton conversation in the Uyghur region, that, if you are going to dance in places where there are no rights and labor protections and human rights abuses, then at some point the chickens have started to come home to roost to say, you know what, operating in those kinds of environments mean now you can't get your goods into Western markets. So I do think there's a business imperative to fix this.
It's really powerful the way the internet has started to sort of pierce the veil of marketing and drive consumer engagement. But I'm curious, Ananya, you made this really powerful point that this way of operating is baked into the business model. So what needs to change? How do we fix this? How do we change the model?
Well, there is a very extreme imbalance of power in the global supply chain. And I think that over COVID, I think we have watched some of the conversations about how unilateral and unfair the contracts are between the brands and their suppliers. There's a unilateralism that is being practiced by brands that are, by any standards, reprehensible. And therefore, we need to bring back balance to the supply chain. And this balance actually has a cost to it. And that is that brands who have, and most of the brands have, made enormous profits, which are outsized. We are not against profits in business, but extreme profits, extreme greed, which is really, there is an element of such absolute uncaring in that profit that one has to, at some point, the global conscience is going to, stick up for the downtrodden in this extreme greed that pervades the global supply chain. So more balance needs to be brought into the supply chain, which means that something we have all said for many years, this is nothing new, that brands have to do a few things. One is pay the actual cost of production, which gives workers living wages and a life of dignity. Second, they have to start producing their goods in a way that's environmentally sustainable. And this doesn't only have to do with the materials they use, which is of course there, or the extreme consumption of water. I mean, all those toxic things, we can go on about it. But it is also the reliance on overconsumption and overproduction, which is part of their business model. So increasingly over the years, as we know, these brands who would have maybe 3 season cycles in a year are having like, a cycle every day or every week, So H&M claims that it replenishes its shelves every day. Every day you can come and find something new. So basically this comes from enormous greed for extreme profits. And I use the word extreme intentionally. These are not normal size profits. These are outsized extreme profits. For this, you have to almost replenish your shelves every day, because you have to tell the consumer to come and buy every day so that you can make more profit. So it's basically not just about the toxicity of the materials that go into the production, but also overproduction and then pushing overconsumption. And as we know, then, you know, consumers on their side are also not millionaires, all of them. So they are also going into debt, buying all this. So it's not just a problem of the workers, it's also the problem of the consumer. But since I'm on the labor side, I'm of course focusing on workers who are definitely suffering the most because they are at the bottom of the supply chain.
But I want to speak on behalf of the consumer again. And I want to say consumerism is changing. And this is the right time. This is the right period. And I think for the first time, we actually have a right period where we can change the discourse. And we change the discourse from the consumer's point of view. And I think campaigns like Who Made My Clothes and the good use of social media is where we get to start people questioning where did this come from? And I'm also very curious to know about labeling. How is it that when a product is fully embroidered, embellished, created by artisans in India, it has a label that says made in Italy or made in France? So this is an area that would be interesting to study and to see what are the laws that regulate labeling. Because we do look at our labels. We look at it to see the wash care. We look at it for other reasons.
I think that goes to the heart of the point that Ananya raised around the power imbalance. That the people who make these clothes, who have the skills, the artisans, are not the ones who are recognized and not the ones who are given value within our globalized supply chain. And that helps contribute to this, you know, vast problem that we're talking about. But so one thing I'm curious about, you know, we've talked about what this problem is, that it's really long-standing. Everyone sort of seems to have pretty good ideas of the kind of things that are needed to change this and make things better. And we've also talked about how there's a lot of consumer pressure to make change. So why aren't we seeing more progress? Aisha, I'm curious if you have a view on what are the barriers here? Why aren't things changing?
I mean, I have one word answer: money. You know, why are things changing? It's money. It all comes down to that. I mean, you know, so much of what Ananya was saying, I 100% agree with. You know, as we have been beating the drum to socialize sustainability, get everyday people to care, to recognize that it's high-skilled labor behind their clothes, you've started to see brands, on the other hand, really co-opt those sustainably woke citizens to sell them more products. Suddenly we've got, you know, sustainable materials and circularity and capsule collection here and there. And, you know, to Ritu's point, there is no regulation around labeling. You know, anyone can slap a sustainability label on their product. So even for the well-meaning customer who's out there trying to do right and really wear their values and, you know, purchase from an ethical brand, it's hard to know. We pick up a lot of confusion around, you know, is this brand sustainable? Is that brand sustainable? Because it turns out they're all labeling themselves as such. And so I think first and foremost, you know, it really starts with language. And we know this with any fight that we have ahead of us. And so, as you know, Sarah, we say garment makers, we don't say workers, because for too long, workers have been dehumanized in the supply chain. It's a cost center, it's far away somewhere. We're looking at costing sheets and trying to squeeze it down to the last penny or cent. And so it's to reframe the conversation to say labor, whether sitting on a factory floor or whether a karigar or an artisan, is high-skilled work. And so, you know, make it open costing. Why is it that FOB price is so hidden today? Why is it that a brand gets to decide what the price is? And then guess what? If you don't bring it down to the last penny, they're going to go to the next factory over there and, really play up this asymmetry of power. So I really think our work, as sitting here in the Western market, is cutting through some of that sustainability clutter and using very simple language for people to say, if you care about sustainability, it really comes down to two things: climate justice and gender justice. And the way we're going to achieve those two things is through living wages and degrowth. And unless a brand is talking about those two things, we're going to get nowhere. And it turns out that no business, especially in the ultra pandemic profits, as we've seen to Anania's point, the inequity in the industry is so clear. The volume of profit that brands who canceled orders have made over the last year completely rings home the point that there are certain billionaires sitting at the very top for which the system works. And whether retail worker, wholesale worker, or garment worker, the system is not working. And so what we're really needing is solidarity. What we're needing is really a pushback to unions, because we know that voluntary efforts do not work, codes of conduct and auditing do not work, and to really recenter the language around wages.
I think it's really striking that when you break it down like that, it's basic. Pay people enough to live on and give them credit for their work and give them a voice. And it's sort of striking that something that when you boil it down is, like you say, something that has been in the atmosphere, something we talked about for generations, we still haven't achieved. But I did just want to get into one tension you raised, that Aisha, which I think is important as we think about this going forward. How do we achieve justice for our makers as well as degrowth? How do we ensure, as we're looking towards operating the industry in a more environmentally sustainably way, that we move towards a just transition, that people who are working in the industry now are not squeezed out by technologies, that the language we use to justify operating in a more responsible manner isn't actually destroying livelihoods?
I would just say that this dichotomy, and in some ways a falsehood that the industry has perpetuated, that we need sweatshops and we need the pillage of natural resources and women working at this inhumane rate because at least we're creating jobs, and at least these are sweatshop jobs are better than no jobs. Because it turns out that if you were paying a living wage, if you did operate in a humane pace of production, you would be leaving a generation of women and artisans better off. And what that means is that as automation comes, and it is here, and some of these jobs go away, you're lifting a generation of women out of poverty rather than simply enriching the white CEOs that sit at the very top. So in my mind, it's a $2.6 trillion industry. The money is there. It's just the equitable sharing and the recognition that this is high-skilled work that is constantly dehumanized is the question that we have to tackle. And I think with degrowth, the only thing that I see is a need even sooner and faster to push for living wages, because it is a race against time, because we aren't going to operate in the kind of model of putting out this volume of product. Our earth can't sustain it. And as we think about the vintage market and the secondhand market and the way those are growing, and to be thinking about fashion as a service rather than a good, it's to say, well, what's to happen to most of the women in our part of the world where our economies heavily rely on these jobs? And so to me, that simply means that the living wage conversation has to be urgent.
Yeah, I think it's that really interesting balance between, as you said at the beginning or two, an opportunity created by the focus and the setback from the economic impact. And I think there's also the complexity that we haven't really delved into here, but we should address around what's happening in China at the moment, and the fact that you are now seeing an incredibly powerful market put pressure on brands to continue to operate in a place where, I think most Western organizations have said it's not morally acceptable to operate in. And I think that's a new challenge for brands to navigate.
I think the moral question here for Western brands is, are you wanting to follow the money? And, knowing how important China is from a market continue to operate there? Or are you going to be on the right side of history? And we have certainly seen in the last 48 hours, brands who have taken down their statements, who have diluted their statements around whether or not they're operating in that area. And it's simply because, you know, they want the Chinese market open to them. So essentially, the industry has played this dangerous dance of being in places where you don't have rule of law, where you don't have enforcement. And now you have this conundrum of, well, human rights abuses, you know, how far are you willing to go in order to continue to expand your bottom line?
Yeah, and I think it speaks this really interesting complexity when we talk about the push from consumers, because geographically, consumers have very different push factors.
I mean, you know, the citizens in China and the influencers in China pushing back on the brands who have these statements. So yes, absolutely. And, you know, within Remake, we really try to socialize people to be thinking of themselves as citizens first and consumers second, because the truth is we're not going to consume our way into a sustainable fashion future. The only way for us to be thinking about these issues is from a citizen standpoint, to be standing in solidarity with workers around the world. But I tell you, Sarah, there are days I'm very hopeful when I see, you know, the solidarity we've seen with retail workers, wholesale workers here in the US, you know, locking arms with garment workers around the world, and the fight, you know, the fiery way that these women barely in their 20s in Myanmar were telling us, you know, we are going to fight for our democracy.
And Ananya, I'd be really curious to, you know, as a labor organizer, I'd be really curious to get your perspective on the opportunity versus risk situation here.
Well, I think that this is actually a time for, this is a time of opportunity and radical change. That's what I have been saying, that in a time of crisis, we tend to become more timid and think of incremental change because things are so bad. But precisely because things are so bad and the fault lines have been exposed so starkly, that we have a much more educated population in general, and a lot of hidden things have come forth to and become visible. So it is also an easier time to have certain conversations in bigger spaces than was formerly possible. So I think that my suggestion these days, this is what I keep saying, is that we should not be retreating from our goals. In fact, we should push forward with much more determination, and by no means should we slow down or reduce our ambitions around the world that we want to see. Freedom of association is extremely important, and I see every day how the brands are really colluding with suppliers to create a coercive workplace and keep unions out at the same time that they claim that they are supporting freedom of association. So I think our ability to measure brands' commitment to freedom of association, our ability to gauge their commitment has to become sharper. And so this is a time to move forward ambitiously and aggressively on all fronts, keeping in mind the goals that we have treasured for some time now.
I think that's a really optimistic and powerful note to end on. Thank you, Ritu, Ananya, and Aisha, so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I know it was a lot to pack in a short time, and we could, as always, keep talking for a lot longer, but this has been so interesting. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. Now we'll examine how the materials the fashion industry uses affects the impact on the planet. Here's a little video.
Materials. The fashion industry's raw materials rely on an extractive model. Most clothes are made using fossil fuels. Oil-based polyester is the most commonly used fabric in the world. Fashion's second favorite fiber is cotton, a product with a complicated environmental footprint whose links to modern slavery are deeply problematic. Reuse and recycling of existing materials isn't yet happening at scale, but is a big opportunity for improvement. Growing interest in regenerative agriculture, which seeks to restore soil health and biodiversity, also offers avenues to address this issue over the long term.
So as you've just heard, regenerative agriculture is an area that's attracting growing interest from fashion companies. And it holds out the prospect not only to reduce the industry's impact, but also to make the effect on the planet positive. But there's a long way to go to make that prospect a reality. Now, BoF's chief correspondent Lauren Sherman will explore what it's going to take to get there. Daniela Ibarra-Howell is a member of our Sustainability Council based in Boulder, Colorado, USA, and is co-founder and chief executive at the Savory Institute, an international nonprofit focused on facilitating the large-scale regeneration of the world's grasslands. Nishant Chopra is founder at the Oshadi Collective, a contemporary fashion brand based in Tamil Nadu, India, that is establishing a seed-to-stitch supply chain based around regenerative cotton. And Nina Morenzi is the founder and director of The Sustainable Angle, a London-based nonprofit that runs a regular showcase of sustainable and innovative textiles. Over to you, Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And, I love that we're representing 4 different time zones from morning to evening in this session. So appreciate you being here. Thanks so much. So we all know that most of the materials used in fashion are made using fossil fuels. We know that the supply chains and the way that these products are made aren't always ethical. They're definitely not always efficient. But why are raw materials such a, what is the broad impact of raw materials in fashion, the ethical, the environmental? Why is this something that brands need to pay attention to right now? Nina, maybe we can start with you. I'd love to hear kind of big picture, what you do and why this is such an important topic that every brand, big and small, should be paying attention to at this moment.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Thanks for having me here. Congratulations to the summit and the sustainability index that BoF's put together. It's really good. So yes, the materials have an enormous impact. If you're looking at, in general, it's about 90% of a fashion brand's impact actually comes from materials. And that's mainly in sort of scope 3. That means it's beyond the actual direct ownership of a brand. It's really deep down in the supply chain. That means it's anything from the spinning, the dyeing, it's the weaving, it's where the fabrics really get made. And that's also where then a lot of pollution and emissions are created. It's a very energy intensive part of the supply chain. And so materials really are a great place to start making changes. And it's also where, and I'll come to why I'm involved in this, but it's also where the designer as such actually has a huge influence to play, because he's the one who's actually taking the decision what, and him and the buying team, of course, are making the decisions as to what material should be chosen. And that then has a huge impact. Is this going to be positive for the environment? Is this a negative? The designer really has a hugely crucial role. And so as much as the fabrics and the materials are such a crucial stage in the impact, it's also where a lot of the solutions are lying. And this is why, as the Future Fabrics Expo, which I'm running, the whole idea there is that we're putting all the solutions out there so that the designers really can come in and they can find in one go, in one dedicated central place, all the solutions to make fashion that is responsibly made, doesn't have labor rights abuses, people have dignified working conditions, and importantly also, of course, that the environmental impact is really low and that we can show that all in one go with a lot of background information and sustainability information given, so that really fashion can be made sustainably and responsibly with such materials.
So you're really working with the brands when they're buying the fabric or materials outright. Daniela, can you speak a bit about your role in this and what you're working on currently and how it pertains to potentially where it ends up with Nina?
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am the CEO of the Savory Institute, and at the Savory Institute, we work with a global network of professionals and solutionaries and social entrepreneurs that work with farmers in their own regions to make sure that their farming practices and actually ranching practices, animal agriculture, are done in a way that restores biological diversity, restores climate, restores the cultural and social fabric of the community. So when we talk about agriculture, so we're going back to the raw materials that brands are sourcing of natural fibers. We focus mainly on animal fibers, cashmere, wool, hair, and leather. And so it's very important that the brands get closer to understanding first, what is the impact of the actual raising of those animals, both environmental, ethical, from a point of view of animal welfare. And when it comes to animals, and let's think of herbivores on grasslands, that's where the most of our work is done. So in different grasslands environments, we help pastoralists and ranchers and farmers make sure that animals are allowed to express their natural instincts through very strategic planning. Are on grass, they are always creating the conditions for life to emerge rather than not. We know feedlots, which is part of the livestock system, are broken. We're trying to move away or create the conditions to move away from that. But still, on the grasslands, on the pastures of the world, you can be regenerating or degenerating. It's unfortunately, through the past century, we have had consolidation and specialization, and everything has become more mechanized, and agriculture has become very technological and very chemistry oriented. And we're trying to go back to a biological process of restoring the eroded both ecological and social wealth that has happened in the last 100 years. So for brands to understand where to find those farmers that are doing things well, that are contributing to solving some of our environmental issues and ecological issues that we're facing, is very important, and it's very hard for them. So trying to organize that side of the equation to connect conscientious brands to those regenerative producers, then there's all these, not only the stories that are very important because they become real to the consumer and the brand themselves, but also they know they are creating the conditions for being a force of good, which all private businesses should be doing.
And as brands move further and further upstream in their supply chain and take more control, I assume this is a bigger and bigger issue. Nishant, can you speak a bit about, I know that you have your own brand and you also work with other brands on farming and cotton in particular, about what you do and what your role in this conversation is?
Thanks for having me, Lauren. We started partially in 2016. It was just a women's wear brand, and we wanted to. Just a background of what I do is, I come from a family who've been working in textiles for the last 60 to 65 years, specifically industrialized textiles. So I was brought up in this textile hub where it was so much of making, all the most textile factories around India get fed by the fabrics that are made in the place I am based in. And when I come back from finishing my course, I joined my family business, and I just realized the entire textile supply chain. I visit so many factories, I see how the things are done. And when I actually look at it, and I was like, man, how is everything, every single exchange there is through exploiting either the planet or the people and the resources and things like that. And we all know that cotton has a long history of extraction, from people and planet, and is built upon people living in feeding on people living in developing countries by consistently making sure there's no development in their livelihood. So there's always a surplus of disposable labor and resources. Also, I also realized that the problem with the cotton supply chain is merely reflection of desires of one specific individual or a specific brand, often negating the fact that every person who plays a role in the supply chain also has desires. And, for example, the farmer we work with, an artisan we work with, every single person who takes part in the supply chain, wants to have a good life, access to good education, access to good health, have a good night's sleep and, spend some time with family. So every single person on this planet or in this commune have their own desires, but the supply chain, the cotton supply chain has not been reflecting that, or it just reflects one brand's or one person's desires and things like that. And I think that was one of the reasons where I thought of maybe just because there's a system, it necessarily doesn't mean it's right. So maybe we could create an alternate system and make sure it's workable and make sure it's profitable, because it has to be profitable for people to adopt, and and see how we can grow from there. So we created this model from brand. We went to a textile maker. We worked directly with weavers. Then we went downstream, work with dyes. What are the choices we have with dyes? And then we ended up at the farm. And then we realized these ancient practices, which have been lost, we decided to bring, research into that and kind of practice that, which is now called regenerative farming. And I think this is our, our growth from sow to seed.
And can we try to define regenerative farming? It's a very big buzzword right now. I see a lot of conversations around it. Daniela, maybe we can start with you. What does it actually mean, and what are the business benefits of working in this method?
Yes, thank you. Well, there are some definitions out there, but I think we all agree that agriculture as the production of food and fiber from our lands and waters in the past century has resulted in the liquidation of a lot of ecological capital and social capital to create efficiencies of scale, and the metric of success has always been financial returns. So what regenerative agriculture is trying to do, and I think it has gained a lot of momentum in the face of the climate change conversations, is through reactivating, rebuilding the biological health and the social and cultural health of our agricultural systems around the world. We would be able to bring back life to these, to our planet, build resilience, sequester carbon through the photosynthetic process, put it in the soil where it belongs. So now the focus is a lot on soil health, but also agriculture is a human endeavor. And so the cultural and the human component, the social component of agriculture must not be forgotten. So the idea is to rebuild, restore, and regenerate all the things that have been eroded through time.
Nishant, can you speak a bit about what that means in your supply chain and what regenerative agriculture means for the work that you are doing specifically? Just some exact specific points of how it changes the process of, using the cotton you're using would be great.
Regenerative practices for us is relearning or to look at the world, to look at the supply chain around the cotton, where you don't intend to extract cotton out of the soil, but in turn you create this exchange with the ecosystem and the biodiversity around you. It's more like a holistic approach where you not just grow cotton, but you have this willingness to make in conditions of mutual advantage with the soil, with the animal that's on the farm, and animal welfare, and making sure you take care of the water. You don't extract from the public water body, but you grow cotton in that way. And it's also about giving back to the soil, because we've extracted so much from the soil that it's less in supply now, which means we have to build back. So compared to organic. Organic is like doing things without chemicals, whereas regenerative is actually building the soil, which we have extracted for years and years and years.
And Nina, you're seeing a lot of different materials come in that are using these practices, and then you're also, engaging with brands that are buying these materials. What are you seeing as sort of the end result of these shifts in practices?
Okay, so essentially what we see is that if you're not paying attention to this, if you're not starting to shift your supply chain towards these sort of regenerative organic materials, you're running a big risk, because actually, if you're relying on fibers that are using a lot of fertile soil, irrigation, non-renewable resources such as petroleum, then it's a risky business not starting to shift. And you have to start doing this now, because these inputs, as we call them, are starting to get much more expensive because we're running out of fertile soil. And the global water table is very, very low. Conventional cotton relies on irrigation, for example. So you need to start building a supply chain, for example, that uses regenerative organic cotton, which is mainly rain-fed. So it's very important to start doing this and to really diversify your fiber portfolio, so you're not dependent or overly dependent on these materials such as polyester and conventional cotton. So it's hugely important to start shifting and building new supply partners and long-term partnerships, which actually is very much also the ethos of regenerative organic agriculture, and these relationships with these farmers and consortium, and like the Savory Institute, where they have a lot of different brands working together with the suppliers.
I'd like to hear from all of you on this one, but Nina, maybe we can just piggyback off on this. What is the first step? Say a business has not thought about this at all. Hopefully everyone who is listening in right now has, but say they want to improve their, diversify the kind of fabrics they're using, and they want to incorporate more fabrics grown by or built by regenerative agriculture, however you want to say it. What's the first step that they need to take to incorporate this into their supply chain?
Okay, well, since Daniela is sitting here, it's exactly those kind of organizations that you want to reach out to, and you want to read up, and there's so many pioneering brands that have really shared a lot of their knowledge and information that they've gathered already. So you can read up on that. You can then get in touch with organizations like Savory Institute, like the Regenerative Organic Alliance that we mentioned before, which was also supported at the early stage by Patagonia. You can look at a lot of the actual brands that already have product out there and read up on how they've done it. And I think just being really curious and investing in your teams to have time to read up and gain knowledge, because it is a very new thing. You don't really have graduates who have learned this at university. This is just really evolving super fast. And that's why it's fantastic to really to have these brands that are pioneering and benefit from their sort of footsteps and learn. And then of course you come to fairs, and when you go to whatever our Future Fabrics Expo, we always have show spotlights on these sort of new materials, which again big brands have supported this, like Caring. Also, I think another important thing is you really go to your own partners in the supply chain. You ask them, how come you don't have that? I've heard about this in BoF Summit, and I really want to know whether you're supplying this. So there needs to come a push as well, and a real interest. And then that's an important signal to the suppliers, who will then go and make sure that they, work with the farmers to transition to these systems.
Daniela, what's the starting point for you with the company? I'm sure it differs very, regarding the size of the business and their commitment, but what is the first kind of point of recommendation that you make?
Yep. For us, historically, we've been helping the farmers and pastoralists just to do better for their own benefit, to be more resilient and more profitable. And now there's this opportunity to act for businesses to act as an accelerator, as a de-risker of that shift, because it involves really a lot of risk, at least in the eyes of the farmer, when there are policies and just historical habits and traditions of doing things a certain way. And now they are going to be shifting to something new, and we need to be in this together. So to me, all the actors in the supply chain, I like to call them value networks, have to become more nodal, more relational. They need to understand better. Brands at the beginning had a hard time finding the regenerative farmers. And so only those who had some sort of a celebrity status were found, and everybody were, flocking to them. But the thing is, we have a lot of those. So we need to work together to introduce themselves and bring the brands closer to understand what it means and what are the differences. And I would say, insist on outcomes, on metrics of outcomes. Practices alone are inauditable. You cannot know if the outcome is really regenerative or not. Practices are very contextual. So what works in an area doesn't work in another one. What works one year may not work the following year. That is the farmer's ability to make decisions based on what's happening on that farm. But if you measure and you have metrics of that outcome, that's what what allows to back your claim that you're sourcing regenerative. That is one. Second, invest in the supply chain, because there's not too much regenerative out there. So invest in capacity building, invest in the infrastructure, be part of the solution with your budgets that are tied to sustainability budgets or corporate social responsibility budgets. It doesn't need to affect your cost of goods, but put it in ways in which you're creating real change. And then use your marketing voice, your marketing machines to be education for the consumer. So learn from the farmer and then turn around and inform and educate the consumer, so the consumer then can make it a good business for you to be sourcing from these farmers. And so going from more a marketing and a brand to tap onto the ego of the consumer into tapping into an education and legacy for our decisions. So I think those are three things that brands can start doing and reinforce that supply resilience and consistency through time.
Nishant, what's the first question you get from brands that you're advising? Does it have to do with budget and ability, or what is, if someone wants to do what you've been doing, what is the first thing you'd say for them to do?
I think we've been fortunate enough to work with brands, and like everyone who we work with have a deep understanding of how these things work, just general respect for nature and making things better. I think when it's really important to become intimate with the supply chain, just asking, not imposing things like, hey, you have to make this certification happen, but having a timeline, and not starting with 100 acres is necessary, but you can start with just 1 acre, maybe 100 meters of fabric. And that's how we started, 1 acre, 5 acres of farm. And from 5 acres, you slowly grow, you understand the nuances of doing things, like why is a farmer not being able to do organic because he doesn't have budget or he doesn't have these things, and how do we make sure to make it an exchange that, it's the entire burden doesn't fall upon a farmer or a supplier or a weaver or an artisan, but it's shared equally. And when we do things together as a community, the growth is way beyond. I think if we just had this women's wear brand, and if we had to do things as a women's wear brand, things would not be, growing at a pace it's growing now. So we decided that, hey, we need to work with community, because we might not have something another brand has. And, when us come together, it becomes when you hold hands together, it's easier to achieve something. And I think that's where you start. You create an exchange, you partner, and you don't impose, but you understand and make things happen.
So what are the roadblocks? If you think about something like organic cotton, it's been a conversation for 20, 30 years at this point, and it hasn't seemed to scale in a way that, as someone who covers the industry broadly, it seems to make logical sense, but hasn't scaled as much as you would think with bigger corporations that use a lot of cotton. What are the roadblocks for making these processes the standard? And how are the work that all of you are doing, how are you kind of pushing through that? Do you think 5-10 years from now, every big business and a lot of small ones will be using fabrics made from regenerative agriculture? Or do you think that there are too many variables in our supply chain, in you know, the way that this business operates to make this really happen on a broad scale? Daniela, maybe we can start with you.
Well, I think the moment we start to understand the true cost of doing our business and account for all those things that we leave out there for governments or NGOs or, you know, to take care of, from, you know, climate issues to, you know, farmers really social and life well-being degradation. You know, suicide is one of the main sources of death among farmers globally. And so that extractive model doesn't work, but someone else is taking care of that. Some other part of the economy is taking care of that. Disasters, you know, tied to climate change, food insecurity, pandemics, all that seems to be someone else's issue. But business has a huge role to play. Unfortunately, the design of the supply chains now favor efficiencies of scale, and that sort of, you know, let's squeeze every little penny from each part of the supply chain. When we look into what would a regenerative design entail, and that is more relational, in which, you know, we start understanding that the cost of what we do is part of the cost of what we're selling, and that the consumer, the citizen, understands that that needs to be part of our investment, and looking at higher quality and more, you know, long-term, you know, fashion trends, and create a more conscientious overall, you know, supply network, including the consumer. If otherwise, we'll have to start with policy and penalties, because eventually it won't work for any part of society. So the sooner we start moving in that direction and aligning, and markets move faster, policy will follow, the sooner we can understand what is a truly sustainable regenerative model for fashion. And the ones that are leading today are the ones that are going to be leading for a long time. So the sooner you move forward, I think it'll be good business for you.
You know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that would have been also one of my first points. But I think another thing that is really not helpful is that government subsidies are still very much going to intensive agriculture. And that is, you know, not only is it extremely holding everyone back, but also it just gives totally the wrong signal, and it's actually very confusing to a lot of people, and certainly doesn't help with COP26 coming. So it's a real problem, so that needs to be addressed. I think generally regulation and government should really incentivize people to do the right thing, helping farmers. It would also mean that I guess it would help to also get much more funding and financing into this, because that is unfortunately a lot of these projects, and regenerative agriculture means that financing is upfront. So a large chunk comes from is needed really to enable these transitions. So that's another problem, but nothing that can't be overcome. It's just one of these sort of first things that come to mind that could be fixed, but is unfortunately still a bit of a roadblock. I guess also a lot of the producers, and I'm sure Nishant is going to talk about that, are just in need of more skills and knowledge, and that just takes time, and that again needs to be supported. And it's again something that a government could easily facilitate more, and also bring in the point about climate and how much regenerative agriculture actually helps sequestering atmospheric CO2 emissions, and that is a huge benefit which really should be supported by government. It's pretty much a no-brainer, really.
Nishant, how do you feel about government regulation and support, and kind of piggybacking on what Nina just spoke about? How important do you think that is to move this whole movement forward?
I think government support can really make things like really fast to change, but I do think like to start, you just need like an intention. You're like, you know, every brand needs to have that intention and not just being settled in a comfort zone, but the willingness to start somewhere. I think everyone's just there and like, you know, they go behind these numbers and like, how do we make sure we have ROI and things like that. But when you enter into a project like this, it's not an ROI like right away. Long term it is, because you know that is the future of things, or the future is bleak for this world. But I think when we get into this, it's having like a more like a long term view, and not just like, there's another thing with relationships I always think, which is like a big roadblock. Again, not having this relationship of sympathizing with farmers or sympathizing with these artisans, because that is a roadblock, because that is a kind of ripple it leaves, but rather like respecting the work. And when you have that sort of respect and not sympathizing, I think it's easier for brands to accept those things and, you know, grow from there. And again, coming back to the government thing, I think with the government, I still don't understand that. Why is it like everyone knows that putting chemicals into the soil or river is so toxic and so many people get affected with so many different kind of diseases? It's just like really bizarre that government still is okay and still now have like policies, because invisibly it's affecting people, like, you know, it's causing cancer. And it's just like, I think having like really stringent government policies, this or that kind of policies, can really bring about a faster and quick change towards these things.
Got it. We don't have much more time, but there was one little question I wanted to ask you all because it's a bit specific. Samantha asked about hemp. She said that this is someone from our audience. Do you have any opinion about hemp as a regenerative fiber, possibly to replace cotton? Naturally requires less irrigation, pest control, etc. The reason I want to know what you think about this is A, how important is alternative fibers to this conversation, and B, you know, every once in a while I've been hearing more and more about hemp in the last few years, and that probably has to do with the legalization of marijuana in the US, you know, in certain areas of the US for medical and also recreational use in some states. But I think sometimes there will be a new material or a new object, obviously hemp isn't new, but a new thing that companies kind of position as the problem solver for a bigger issue. Do you think that alternative fibers or alternative types of fabrics are part of solving this problem? Or do you think that we need to solve the problem on the materials that, you know, brands use and consumers consume on a regular basis today? And Daniela, maybe we can start with you and go through the team, and then we will wrap up.
Great. Well, hemp, as any other natural plant or any species, could be good or could be bad. It's not. It all depends on the production model. So the three things you need to look at is the diversity of plants in one farm, the condition of the soil surface, is it bare, is it covered, and the biological processes rather than mechanical or chemical, as Nishan was saying. So hemp can be done with all the wrong, you know, design model, with all the right. The same with cotton. Cotton is a very tough one to tackle. But if we look into the design to bring diversity, to cover ground, to use biological versus mechanical and chemical, any species, it's all about management.
Nina, what about you? What do you think? Seeing a lot more hemp in your, roster of materials?
Definitely. And also in a lot of really good denims, there's a lot of hemp being blended in, so it's not just 100%. So immediately that brings down the environmental impact, because mainly denim is made of cotton. But what I would say more in general, of course, Daniela is absolutely right, and she's the expert on this, but I would say that in general, we like hemp just because it's a hardy crop. It doesn't get attacked easily by pests, doesn't really need fertilizer as much. It grows on marginal land, so it doesn't compete with food. It blends well. It doesn't need to be irrigated, so it's rain fed, can grow in moderate climates. So there's a lot of really good, there's a lot of advantages with that crop in general, especially in blends. Check it out.
And Nishant, what do you think?
I think it's really important to focus on crops that are native to your region, like bringing and growing hemp in the place where we live will be like growing mangoes in Alaska. Like it just doesn't work. So you need to find like what works in your space and making sure like you push that. Like, you know, for us, we chose a cotton supply chain, not because we wanted to work with cotton, but because like cotton was native to this region and we had like a direct connection and, you know, so you figure out like what works. So you see in the US, a lot of cotton thing doesn't work because cotton is not supposed to be grown there. And like, you know, you cannot grow, it's very difficult to grow organic cotton or like a regenerative cotton in US. And that's why people are struggling. Like, you know, they have like tons of BT seeds or like GMO seeds to, you know, cut the forces of nature, which of course doesn't work. Like, you know, you need to work with your local materials, local region, finding out what grows best here, what is this soil suited for, what is this atmosphere, the climate, like all of those conditions, how are people skilled, like what kind of supply chain do you have in that space, and making sure you focus on those kind of aspects rather than growing hemp here would be like really unsustainable, I would say, or growing cotton in Alaska would be really unsustainable, you see. So I think that point of view is better to look at materials.
I think the theme of today is holistic, looking at the big picture, is solving the problems with, you know, the big picture with many different points. So thank you all so much, Danielle and Nina and Nishant.
Thank you.
You were amazing. I learned a lot and
much.
really appreciate it. Thanks to the audience, and back to Imran.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. I learned a lot too from Nishant, Nina, and Daniela. That was very interesting conversation. We'll be right back after this break for a conversation on emissions. The fashion industry's significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions makes it an important player in our efforts to mitigate the global climate crisis.
Emissions. The fashion industry is one of the most potent polluters on the planet. The industry's greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to be between 4 and 10% of the global total. Without significant intervention in the next decade, the industry will continue to contribute considerably to the climate crisis. Much of fashion's impact takes place in the manufacturing supply chain, outside of companies' direct control. That means active collaboration and co-investment with manufacturers is needed, as well as engagement at the policy level to encourage a shift to greener energy sources.
Now, BoF's Deputy Editor, Brian Baskin, who's based in New York, will discuss what needs to change with a group of leading experts. Michael Sadowski is an independent sustainability advisor who is based in Portland and works across the apparel and footwear sector to advance circularity and climate solutions. And he's also a valued member of our Sustainability Council. Hannah Pang is head of marketing and advocacy at Futera, a London-based consultancy that helps businesses develop sustainability strategies. And finally, Leila Petri, another Sustainability Council member, is Chief Executive of independent consultancy 2050, whose clients include industry coalition, the Fashion Pact. Over to you in New York, Brian.
Thank you very much, Imran. Controlling greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit the effects of climate change is perhaps the greatest challenge the planet faces. And fashion, as you just heard, has a significant role to play in that fight. In the last 2 years, many of the industry's biggest brands have taken steps to address emissions within their own supply chains, and perhaps more importantly, to create structures that allow for unprecedented levels of cooperation on this issue. But it can be hard to tell how effective the industry's efforts have been and what else needs to be done to address climate change. And I look forward to digging into this topic with my guests today. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage everyone in the audience to put any questions or thoughts you might have into the Slido chat on the right side of your video feed, and we'll get to as many of your responses as we can later in the session. And with that, let's begin. So Michael, I'd like to start with you and get a little bit meta. Why is this fashion's problem to solve? I mean, let's say I'm Nike or Gucci and I look around and I say, I sell clothes, I'm not making cars, I'm not operating a coal-fired power plant. Why do I need to be thinking about this so urgently right
now? Sure. Thank you, Brian. So I think it's important to note that it's humanity's problem to solve, and fashion is one sector that needs to decarbonize. So regardless of what sector you find yourself in, we know that we have to reduce emissions very significantly between now and 2030 and then on the way to 2050. And so roughly reducing emissions by half by 2030 and then to net zero by 2050. There are a number of estimates of fashion's greenhouse gas footprints. We can talk about this in a bit more detail. The data is not ideal. But we do know that fashion does have a significant carbon footprint, and as with other sectors, it must reduce that. And so, you know, we know the effects, and we know the predictions of where we're going if we keep on this business as usual trajectory. And so, fashion, because of its impacts, and also because it's seeing the impacts of climate already happening in the supply chain, in particular, in places where the impacts of climate are being are happening, we know that it's a critical issue for the sector to address.
Thank you. And I'd love to get into the data question in a little bit, but first, Layla, on this more than almost any other issue we're talking about today, we hear a lot about the need for collective action for the industry to work together. And you've been involved in some of the industry's biggest efforts on this front. And I'd love for you to tell us how that's going first, how much progress has been made, and also why it's so necessary for brands to think of this as an industry problem as opposed to their problem as a brand.
I mean, I think fundamentally, this is a problem which no individual company can solve on its own. You know, we have all sorts of really intractable issues around infrastructure, around incentives, around policy, and no one actor can really operate within that system without being affected by it. So all these brands have supply chain scope 3 targets that are also dependent on other actors. And really what we've realized is that, you know, everybody in this sector is codependent on each other and other actors like policymakers and suppliers to succeed. So I think that's really spurred a lot of the collaboration that we see. So for example, the Fashion Charter, the Fashion Pact, now TE and SAC have targets around climate as well that are shared. But I think the challenge remains that lots of brands and companies and some suppliers around the table are really taking a lot of action, but we're not yet bringing everybody around that table. You know, we're not yet properly facilitating those discussions with policymakers, although efforts are definitely underway. We've not yet fully balanced out the engagement with brands versus, let's say, supply chain actors, raw materials producers, those who are further down the value chain. And although there is some engagement with financial institutions, I think in particular there, we can do more, because unless we unlock financial flows to, you know, address the challenging issues about investment in parts of the value chain, we're really not going to succeed in the kind of transformation that's needed to become 1.5 degree aligned. So yeah, I think there's been huge progress, and it's extremely encouraging to see all these companies come together and these collective programs exist. But I think the next stage is very much about really expanding that influence beyond those we're comfortable with, and really reaching out beyond into the value chain and with all these other kinds of actors.
And then Hannah, you're the one advising companies about how to talk about this very complicated topic to consumers. I mean, do you think the industry is succeeding at getting its customers to care about emissions, and what could it be doing better?
Definitely. I think it's we've made a lot of progress in this space. We know that there's increasing consumer demand for this type of information. And I think if we think about what we need to do moving forward, and something that came up a lot in the index is the gap between where we're going and what we're doing to get there. So we sometimes talk about it as we no longer have a problem knowledge gap, but we have a solutions knowledge gap. So we know the direction, we know the vision that we're going in, but now we want to know how are we going to get there, and consumers are increasingly interested. So I think we saw some really interesting examples of this in this past year with the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a lot of lip service to it, but consumers then wanted to know, okay, what are you actually doing? What are the actions that you're taking to be able to be able to speak to that in a credible way. And I think it's the same with climate. We're seeing that with the youth climate movement. They're demanding to know what you're doing. And from some of the research that we've done at Futera, we've seen this increase massively over the past couple of years, especially with the rise of purchasing power for Gen Z. So, they're the ones who grew up with fake news. They want to know the information, they want the proof points, they want to know what you're tangibly doing to get there. And they want to be involved in the process as well. So also, how are you helping them be more sustainable as well?
And earlier when we were talking, a couple of you raised the point that too much information can also be a problem, can almost be counterproductive to provide this deluge of facts and figures and different programs that different brands are working on. Why is that a danger, and how do you strike the right balance in communicating this?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, it can be a form of greenwashing as well. If you're just dumping a huge amount of data out into the world that takes ages and ages to sift through, then that's not really helpful or useful for anyone, especially for consumers when they're not the experts in sustainability. They just want to know the impact of the thing that they're trying to buy from you, and to ensure that your actions align with what you're speaking to, so they can double check, okay, my values aligned with this company or this brand that I'm buying into. So at Futera, we often talk about the value of honesty versus transparency. So transparency can just, as I said, be this kind of dump of data and you consider it to be transparent, but honesty requires you to be vulnerable, to talk about where you are in the process, and to let people know if you're not tracking towards these targets, why aren't you tracking towards them, and what are you doing to get back on track?
Well, and I think so. There's also probably a difference between point of sale communication and then just sort of general brand communication and narratives in the media. Because I do see, on the other hand, a somewhat dumbing down of the messages that people want to tell about sustainability challenges, because they want a nice, shiny answer that's going to make people feel good. And of course, we want to be positive, but sometimes reality is quite complex and nuanced. And the number of times I've written a very careful explanation for someone in a media outlet who's then gone, no, we just want 3 bullets and fluffy. And I think, we don't want to overwhelm consumers when they're trying to make purchasing decisions, because actually that's an emotional and kind of already complex decision. But I do think in the more general narratives we tell about sustainability at the global level, we should also try to be as open as possible about what is going wrong, what are the complexities, what do we still need to fix, rather than just trying to show the good news all the time, because I think only then will we have brands saying truthfully where they're at on the journey. At the moment, if you say anything about where you're at on the journey, it can open you up to more criticism than saying nothing. So lots of brands and companies are just staying quiet because it's actually quite a safe strategy. So yeah, I think we really need to break that down a little bit as well, and just have much better proxies for that information, much better, cross-industry systems, much better ways of communicating that, but not forgetting the nuance and the realities that we're dealing with.
And Michael, to bring you into this, you're a big advocate for science-based targets. Can you explain what that means, and I guess how that helps consumers and also people in the industry tell when a company is serious about reducing emissions versus just sounding like they're serious?
Sure. So there's an initiative called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's a collaboration between 4 global NGOs, CDP, WWF, WRI, and UN Global Compact. And in brief, they came together to bring clarity and consistency to corporate climate change target setting. Because maybe 5 years ago, companies were coming out with targets that were not really grounded in the right level of ambition that's required to stay within a 1.5 degree Celsius trajectory. And so Essentially, it's targets that are aligned with that trajectory. I think there are about 1,300 companies that are now committed. I think over 100 fashion companies. Increasingly, we're seeing more manufacturers get engaged. I don't think science-based targets are on the radar of consumers, to be totally honest. I think it's very much it's an industry thing. We're talking about it on this call and amongst ourselves. I think it's slowly getting out, but I think it is an important badge to judge whether a company is serious. As part of this, companies have to disclose their progress, which is a key part. And so, in theory, you should be able to look on a company's website or on CDP or on other platforms to see how a company is performing. So there's great ambition and great momentum, but I don't think it's yet a consumer play. I think it's showing up with policymakers, investors, and other stakeholders, but it hasn't made it to consumers just yet.
Mm-hmm. I think the one part of targets that does tend to trickle down to consumers is the date attached to them. I'm often seeing 2025, 2030, even 2050 on some of these targets and some of these initiatives. And I'm curious, maybe a question for any of you who want to take it. How do we hold brands accountable over this long a period of time, and how do you hold consumers' attention for something that might play out over decades?
Yeah, I'll just say, and then I'll let others chime in. The Science-Based Targets Initiative has a time frame requirement. So it says no sooner than 5 years, no longer than 15 years. And so this is why you'll see companies with different target dates. And so you may see 2025, you may see 2030. There's some flexibility built in because companies have different levels of appetite in terms of how far out they want to go with targets. 15 years, I think you could argue, is probably too far out for most companies. I mean, management teams are changing probably every 2 to 3 years. And so I think that's the Science-Based Targets Initiative. The annual reporting requirement, I think, is really key here. So that as a stakeholder, you can look at how is Kering, Nike, Puma, Audi doing in terms of their targets. Brian, I don't think consumers are seeing the date, in my opinion. I'm curious to see how others feel about that. I think we're looking at that for sure, and I think investors are questioning, how are you doing? But I'm not yet seeing that trickle down to consumers, but Leila, Anna, I'd welcome your thoughts on that as well.
I mean, I think from my side, having something like a net zero by 2050 target is a good signaler that you're taking this ambition seriously, that you see the big picture, that your company is thinking long term. And I think companies are prone to not thinking long term. So in a way, that's quite positive. But on the other hand, I mean, as Michael already touched on, the reality is it's almost meaningless to companies to think more than a few years out. So I think there's this sort of balance between having more like tactical targets for the interim and then having these long-term goals. But I think actually what we also need to consider is that the industry itself all needs to pivot to net zero by 2050. And so actually a more meaningful transition in goal setting and accountability that's going to need to happen is to say, how does the whole industry transform and what does that mean for any individual actor within it, which is to a certain extent what the Science-Based Targets Initiative does. But I think we also are now struggling with questions about SMEs and their responsibilities, about how do you allocate the reductions needed across different kinds of actors within the sector. What are those hard to abate emissions versus stuff that just is annoying and costs you a lot of money, and how do we create a fair system that's also going to generate accountability. So I think especially around Scope 3 emissions, there's more work to be done for brands to really get them to that stage of ambition. And particularly I think we struggle with growth as an issue in comparison to the sort of short-term or long-term goals. So I think that's definitely something that we'll need to crack as well. How do you reduce your emissions while still continuing to generate business growth?
And I can jump in from adding consumer kind of into that perspective. And I think that kind of goes back to what we were discussing before, of that's part of the value of speaking about where are you today? So what's happening in the present moment? So I totally agree with your point of these big targets being a great signal that you are moving in the right direction as a company, and that you're committed to it, that it is a long-term plan. It's not just a bandwagon that you're jumping onto. But for what you're doing today, that's the thing that is going to be more interesting to your consumer. So what are the actions that you're taking that will help you reach those long-term goals? And as I mentioned, it's both about, the tangible actions that you are doing today. It's if you're not on track to be able to reach those targets, why is that the case? And what are you doing to get back on track? And what we found is that actually builds trust. So it's not to say that you have to be presenting 100% on track or 100% perfect. That's not what consumers are really looking for. They're looking for honesty about where you are, and if you do mess up and you're not quite on track, why is that the case, and what are you doing to get back onto it? I think as well, just to build on one of my previous points, the other thing that consumers are interested in is how are you helping them be more sustainable? How are you helping them be more climate friendly? So what are the touch points that you have with your consumer that allows them to see how you're bringing your climate action to life, whether that is in store or through how the clothes are made? So how are you communicating that on your hand tags or at your point of sale? So I think we need to think very broadly about our climate communications, and it's of course both industry facing, and it's the science-based targets, and it's the policy and regulation, and it's multi-stakeholder initiatives, and it's also how do we bring our consumers along with us as well. They're the ones who are driving demand, which can help push action further, but they want to be involved, and we need to give them the opportunity to do so, and being transparent and honest in our communications to them will be key in making that happen.
Let's talk about solutions now. Can each of you give me one or two things that look especially promising to you? And just sort of a lightning round. Why don't we start with Michael?
I would say that if you look at the fashion value chain, probably about half of total emissions sit within tier 2. So knitting, weaving, dyeing, finishing. And so really, we have to decarbonize that piece of the value chain, and that requires renewable electricity, which is which is the energy source for knitting and weaving, and then it's going to require a wholesale shift out of coal to generate heat for coloration. And so that part is a big unknown for me. So it's not a solution, but I think there are companies working on different technologies in that space. There's not nearly enough investment. There's not nearly enough work happening in that space to get out of coal within the time frame that we need. But there's, we have the technology on the renewable electricity side to solve that portion of tier 2. I think the challenge there is more on the policy side and on the investment side. But for me, the focus really needs to be on that tier 2 piece. And by the way, I'm not saying that it's those companies, it's really the brands that need to support the fabric that they're buying from tier 2.
And I would kind of build on that, Michael, because I think I still remain optimistic about the potential for unlocking financial flows for especially renewable energy and energy efficiency, because we know that there's in many places a pretty decent payback or risk reduction or kind of commercial benefits from taking those actions. But actually the barriers are more like comfort with that type of change, financial flows and the barriers to lending or kind of operating models that make financial sense, and sort of credit issues. Like there's all a kind of thorny challenge around how do you get the financial flows to those SME actors who need it. But I really see that, development organizations are really ramping up in this space. We start to see like blended finance solutions. We start to see innovation around how to activate that work. But I think the key now will be to actually work with the industry bodies in each geography, with policymakers and definitely with those big financial institutions to try and create mechanisms that will unlock that. The other one I think is very early days, but could be amazing, is regenerative agriculture, because I think although we don't really see scale at all yet around certain agricultural crops or other sort of animal-based products, the potential is there to not only reduce climate impacts, but actually have a net benefit or a restorative impact. So I think if we can get the mechanisms for that right, if we can get it credit for those impacts right, and if we can get the investment flows again right, I think that has huge potential to transform the impacts of the sector.
Are you encouraged by all the talk lately about green bonds and these oversubscribed bond issues and ESG investing in general? I mean, does that mean there's actual momentum on that front?
I mean, green bonds, I think, can be part of the picture, right? I think especially at brand level, they seem like a pretty attractive investment opportunity. And brands are using those to unlock the kind of impact that they need to drive. But I don't see a huge amount of trickle down yet from that to where the need is actually greatest. And I think if you were to generate green bonds at like a municipal level or a country level in production countries, like that might be more meaningful, but they lack the capacity to really put those packages together a lot of times, or at least are not incentivized to do so. So I think those kind of vehicles can be extremely exciting, but I think as yet the people who are using them are those who already have high competency and high financial flows and are already doing quite well. So yeah, I think it's really about using them in the places that need them most now.
And Hannah, what are you seeing on the solutions front?
Well, first, just to say, building off of what Layla was speaking about, I love that reframing of, rather than reducing the amount of problems in the industry, how can we look at fashion as an actual solution to climate change? How can we shift our production and consumption in a way that is actually regenerative? So I think that's a really nice reframing when thinking about the solution side of things, not just individual solutions, but looking at, is there an opportunity for the industry as a whole to be a solution to the climate crisis? And then I think a couple other points, some of what we've been speaking about is with these multi-stakeholder initiatives, with industry-wide collaboration, there's a huge opportunity for us to level up the entire industry when it comes to climate action and sustainability. So I don't think we have to have an incredibly competitive approach and be kind of keeping our cards close to our chest when it comes to how we are becoming more sustainable as individual organizations. So I think the collaboration piece is a huge one in terms of how do we drive action at speed and at scale. And then again, to speak to the consumer side of things, I think what is really exciting for me, or that's something that I'm seeing as a signal, is consumers are asking companies to prove it. So they're asking for the proof points. They're asking to know the details behind what you're paying lip service to. What are you saying in your marketing and communications, and then how are you backing that up both within your corporate side of things, but as well as with your suppliers and how you actually make your products. And then finally, I think one of the most exciting signals for me from a nerdy perspective is I did not think I would see the day where we would have so many kind of carbon footprints on product labels. And that's just has been increasing a lot recently. So, and I think that's an incredibly interesting signal that shows that consumers are actually interested in the impact of the things that they are buying. So that's kind of an interesting one for me as a big signal.
I'd like to turn to an audience question now. The most popular comment by far was about a particular solution that I didn't hear mentioned here, which was carbon offsets. Someone asked, is it a useful tool or an excuse to pollute? Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I'm giving it 2.5 minutes. I'm sure Michael does as well. So, I mean, this is my particular opinion now. I think it has potential to be misused or accidentally misused, to be honest with you. And we spoke about this in our prep call. Like, companies in good faith can be like, oh, look, I've offset a whole range. And actually, that's not really endorsed by some of the world's sort of leading thinkers on this in terms of an approach, because it's just pushing the responsibility onto those that you're offsetting with. And I think offsets can be a very useful tool, but I think it's just about knowing exactly when they're appropriate. And actually, for me, a more exciting thing is to look at how to move beyond offsets towards funding action within the value chain that has measured GHG impact reduction that you can sort of potentially then account for either within your balance sheet or through new mechanisms that maybe are developing around sort of, they don't like the term insetting, but basically insetting, like how do you turn offsets into something that's relevant to your value chain? So I would say that's the most exciting part of the offsetting debate for me, is actually pivoting towards relevant impacts for your value chain and how you fund those.
And I'll just add that the focus should be on reducing emissions.
Exactly.
Period. So that's what the science says. That's what the NGOs work in, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We must decarbonize all sectors at a much more ambitious pace. Offsets can help maybe take the rounding off of that, but frankly, we have to reduce emissions in a major way. So if a company has $1 to spend on an offset, they should put that dollar into some of the things that Layla just mentioned, right? Use that dollar to support research to get at coal. Use that dollar to help your manufacturers put solar up on their roofs. That should be the focus, not planting a tree or, buying a cook stove, et cetera. It should be on reductions.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's a huge opportunity for communications as well, to be able to explain what you mean when you use terms like this. So if you're using terms like net zero or offsetting, there's so many different types of offsetting. So what are you actually referring to? And I think that's something that brands and companies need to pay more attention to, because they are going to be asked more and more questions about this, because we are increasingly educated on the different types. So completely agree. We first need to aim for an absolute reduction of emissions, and then focus on offsets like carbon sequestration. And then, kind of figure out what's the level going down and down, but absolute reduction is definitely the first step.
We're coming to the end of our time, but to conclude, I wanted to quickly go back to something Hannah said about cooperation and how brands need to set aside rivalries to address this. And I'm curious, how do we actually make that happen? How do you convince Nike, if they do find some way to operate more sustainably at a pretty low, manufacturing cost, to share that with a rival instead of keeping that for themselves, for example?
I think brands mostly are quite excited to collaborate, as long as the structure's there to facilitate it and it's not a direct competitive advantage to each other. So you see a huge amount of cooperation, sharing of best practices with supplier engagement, sharing of technical best practices, funding things together, really wanting to collaborate. I think the only place where I feel attention is sometimes around external messaging, or around things that are about opening up new market opportunities. So where you see people being quite competitive is new sale platforms, new mechanisms for getting income as a brand. That's when it starts to break down. But I think up until that point, actually, it's more just about creating the places where they can collaborate. And also doing it at pace, because that's the other thing I see, is that they just get bored of waiting and go off and do it on their own. But if we could do it quickly together, I think that would still be the preference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brian, I would say, just to echo Layla's point, cooperation is happening. And I think this industry is probably more collaborative than most industries. But I think this collaboration is effectively a substitute for the government stepping in and pushing the industry to move faster. And so we should applaud brands and manufacturers for collaborating. And yet, to be honest, I don't think we're going to see the pace that we need without, the proper regulation that actually requires manufacturers, and then that actually forces brands to step up and actually co-invest in these solutions. And so, hooray for collaboration. And, I think we're in trouble without regulation, because cooperation is not going to pull us through. Consumers are absolutely not going to pull us through on this. We need proper government oversight to make this all work.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for a great discussion, and back to you in the studio.
Thank you so much, Brian, Michael, Layla, and Hannah. Don't go away. We have more coming up in just a moment, when Sarah will be back to discuss the critical role that transparency plays in fashion's sustainability journey. Stay with us.
Transparency is the foundation of any effort to operate more sustainably. So why is the industry still so bad at it? How we change that is the subject of our next talk.
Transparency. The fashion industry is systemically opaque. Fashion's global and extended supply chains are murky. Most brands don't know where the raw materials they use are made. This allows human rights abuses to go undetected and makes it difficult to measure and mitigate pollution and other environmental damage. Companies can employ new technologies to help increase transparency and streamline supply chains to make them easier to monitor and manage. More work is also needed to establish high-quality, verified environmental data.
The fact fashion remains so opaque is a systemic failing when it comes to efforts to operate more sustainably, and one of the most fundamental things that needs to change if fashion is to be held accountable for its environmental and social ambitions. In our next session, I'm sitting down with Sustainability Council member Linda Greer. Linda is Global Fellow at the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, and her work has been absolutely foundational in driving more sustainable practices in the fashion industry. Hello, Linda, from the US. So this is a normal time for you, actually, unlike many of the other people who've joined us today.
I feel very spoiled, yes.
Yes, no early starts. So this is a topic that you and I have discussed a lot, and one that I think is pretty much fundamental to every single one of the sessions that we've had so far today. But transparency is also a bit of a catch-all term that could cover a lot of things. So I wondered if we could start by just really talking about what we mean when we say we want the fashion industry to be more transparent. What are we asking for here?
You know, I think it's pretty simple, and there's no reason to make it more complex than it is. We want to know what their environmental impacts are, and we want numbers associated with those impacts. And we want to see where they're headed. You know, where are they starting and where are they going? I'm speaking just about environment right now, but of course this would also apply to labor issues as well. So in environment, it's not mysterious. We want to know their greenhouse gas emissions. We want to know their chemical use. We want to know their water usage, the topics we've been talking all morning in today's session. And we need that to be tracked and traced and reported on. And, you know, let me just say, when I was thinking about our session this morning and preparing to talk to you, I was thinking about how have we gotten to the point that this is still being discussed the way that it is, that we're still needing to explain and justify the need for transparency in the industry. And what struck me is, more than 10 years ago, this industry was catching a lot of flack for its environmental impacts. And they were really needing to respond to a big visible problem that they were causing with their pollution. And as a result, they responded in this huge flurry of, commitments and statements and sustainable reports and the creation of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and the ZDHC commitment letters, et cetera. And so it seems like, they're making a lot of talk, but then of course, making claims, like show me that you're doing it. I didn't recommend to these companies to make these big promises and claims, but if they do make these big promises and claims about their commitment to sustainability, you can't have it both ways. You can't make the claims and then push back on transparency to be accountable for those claims. Either shut your mouth and don't pretend, or show us that you're really doing it. And I think the heart of transparency is showing us that you're really doing it.
Right. And just to fill in for people in the audience who might not be familiar with some of the organizations that you mentioned, Sustainable Apparel Coalition and ZDHC are two industry groups that were set up, as you said, about 10 years ago. ZDHC to tackle issues around chemical pollution, hazardous chemical use, and SAC really to try and start measuring some of the environmental impacts that the fashion industry is having. And they've really become a fulcrum for the industry to talk about what they're doing to be more sustainable. And yet, notwithstanding this decade or more of work now, we're still at a point where there's not a huge amount of information out there that Linda, yourself, or me as a journalist can look at to see whether there's been real improvement. And I think the obvious next question is, why not? As you said, this is not rocket science. It's quite a simple ask. Why don't we have this information? Why is the fashion industry still so opaque?
I think the first thing that jumps to mind is because they still have a lot to hide. And so the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of opacity in the supply chain that continues today, that so many companies truly don't know, particularly below their tier 1 suppliers, where their materials come from, and then from there all the way down to their fibers. And that although that is somewhat inconvenient sometimes, it's also very convenient because they get plausible deniability that problems associated with those steps of their manufacturing are their own. And so I have to say that it is a problem that I'm not saying there would be no work to solve it, but as you pointed out, the way to solve it is quite straightforward. It doesn't require moonshot activities of some new technology or anything like that. And so I think we have to conclude that there is a level at which this lack of transparency is working for these companies because it allows them to perpetuate the status quo. Now, let me say, though, that it's also true that the world has become a very transparent place, and that transparency is not all up to them anymore. And that, just thanks to the internet and thanks to consumer pressure, companies are making a mistake to not get ahead of this and actually be presenting this information on their own, rather than playing catch up, as they did with Greenpeace for the zero discharge campaign. So I would hope they would learn that lesson, that even if it's sort of for a negative motivation of trying not to get caught, that they would realize that this opacity really is a feature of the past, and that they would be much better off for their own sake to be much more transparent themselves.
Right, and this came up in the last talk on emissions as well, that consumers are asking for it. They want to know, what is the impact of this product? How can I understand whether this is good or bad for the planet? And I don't want to just take your word for it. Show me, prove it to me. Do you think that that is a useful driver that is helping to create more transparency? Or is it also enabling, this came up in the last talk as well, data dumps that can create more greenwashing, or also allowing brands to put out information that maybe isn't particularly high quality or good to make them seem like they're doing more or being more transparent than they really are?
Yeah, I think this is a very timely question, because sort of what would keep me up at night about this is to have all this constructive consumer pressure from a genuine consumer interest in making more sustainable purchases, and then to have them get bamboozled by information that doesn't actually mean anything, and it be a PR exercise where almost anything can be called sustainable or lower impact, et cetera. I think we are at that moment where we have a danger of doing that, and that it will breed tremendous public cynicism and a kind of a backlash against the companies that do it. And I think it will also be very frustrating to government efforts to try to straighten these things out. Again, going back to what I said earlier, the reporting of what really matters here is actually not that mysterious or difficult. So I could see a clear path future for what needs to be, what data needs to be collected and what data needs to be reported, and can imagine a world where we could all agree on that fairly readily. But right now, I think what we are subject to is a lot of confusing reporting and a lot of inconsistency across companies of what they choose to report. And I think that's just going to be very frustrating to customers sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point you kind of touched on there around everyone agreeing on what it is you need to report and how you measure it, because that's something companies raise a lot. They sort of say there's no unified or agreed upon measure for this thing, and therefore it's meaningless really for us to talk about it because no one's going to understand it. So don't worry about it.
What I always think when I hear that is, well, how many environmental professionals do you have on your staff? Because I'm a trained environmental professional. A lot of people I know how to do that. So you may just not have the right people asking this question, and you may be working more in your public relations department than, with the kind of expertise that you might need to solve this problem.
Right, and I think that is definitely an issue within the industry, that a lot of times when companies first come to this question around sustainability, it's from a marketing perspective. It's because consumers are asking about it, and you want to see how you can present that to them. And it's great that that's encouraging companies to come to this, but as you just pointed out, you have to move past that pretty rapidly to to have any credibility on this topic. And, you know, having sort of laid out what this problem is, what are the risks if we don't solve it? You know, you pointed to the issue around regulators, but if we don't have good data in the fashion industry, why is that a problem?
Well, because all of the problems that we need to solve need that data in order for us to solve them. So just, you know, think of the companies right now that are making very excellent commitments, those science-based targets for their greenhouse gas reductions, which I'm very in favor of. But then let's think for 1 minute about, okay, now what do? You've made a commitment for a 45% reduction by 2030 or 2035. Step one, where are my emissions? Step two, you know, in my portfolio of suppliers, who is a hotspot of inefficiency? Who is the model citizen in opposite to that? And then what's my game plan? How am I going to move forward? You know, absent data on that, I just don't see how you develop a game plan and how you accomplish your goals. And again, you know, talk is cheap. So if you have a goal and it's not even till 2035, what is next year supposed to look like for you? What should you be doing right now? So I think without data to drive you internally and without public disclosure of that information so that you're accountable for everything you're telling us about how much you care and what you're planning to do, then I just feel like you're in a circular, you know, pattern of not making progress.
Right. And from a business perspective, this is also strategic. If you really think, as more and more companies do, as investors increasingly are, that climate is a business risk, if you don't have this information, you can't make smart strategic decisions, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it that way. People are just making these statements about what they're going to do without really knowing what the state of play is. What are the solutions? How do we fix this?
So I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that we do need to fix this with government regulation. And we, I think, are at a point, an inflection point here for opening the curtain again to better government regulation. I mean, here in the United States, we obviously have a new administration. The European Union and Great Britain have been ambitious on this. China itself is more ambitious than it has been on these things. And I think we've had a great run trying reliance on corporate social responsibility and voluntary pledges. And I think the jury is in, and that didn't work out for us. It was too complicated. And the companies, you know, maybe they tried their best, but we can't afford another 10 years. You know, what has gotten us this far is clearly not going to get us where we need to be on these matters. So I think government needs to be requiring things. I think they need to require disclosure. Government requires disclosure on many fronts already. This can be another one. And then I think where we do need sort of innovative regulation is thinking through what are the what can national governments require for international behavior, and how can they enforce those requirements so that a functional framework is put out there that will sort of lift all boats, because we don't have great global governance regulatory structures that they can rely upon already. But I do think that's the core component of the solution that we need to put in place.
And in that sense, are we talking about things like mandatory due diligence that will apply in every jurisdiction where a company, rather than a sort of international level set of regulations?
Correct.
And what about, sorry, go on, Linda.
What about what?
So I was going to, and what about, I think, a conversation that comes up a lot and really gets to the heart of why this issue around transparency is such a big issue and why it leads to so much additional complexity is, how do we ensure, without having good data right now, that the regulations being brought into place are the right regulations and are good regulations? And I know within the fashion industry, this is a big debate at the moment around how you legislate for materials, because how you measure the environmental impact of a specific material is quite a hot debate at the moment. Whether a recycled polyester should be measured against the same framework as cotton can, and how you compare the two. given that we don't have a good set of data at the moment, how do we set smart legislation around that kind of thing?
I mean, I think those are very solvable problems in many ways. I spent probably 20 years of my career working on regulatory matters here in the United States, overseeing and trying to strengthen EPA regulations as they came out, as like my business of what I did when I worked for an NGO here. And regulators know how to think these things through. And they'll look at 3 or 4 different options, and they'll propose, and they'll take comment, and then they'll make a decision. And there'll be, good sides and bad sides to the decision that they make. But then that's the decision, and they move forward. And I do feel like these are standard regulatory questions that I'm not saying that they're a snap of the finger, but I certainly think they can be solved, and that they should be solved by people with the experience of regulating industry, because they've seen a lot before, as doing the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Toxic Chemicals Acts that they have. And it won't be like a hot knife through butter, but I think it will be easy to address, and it will sort of settle down the froth that we've been suffering from, where people keep debating and debating and debating because they don't have the authority and the points of leverage to just make a decision and move on.
I think froth is a good word to use here. Even when it comes to regulation, I agree with you that regulation is a big part of this. Do you have a view, though, also on how we address the fact that within this industry in particular, even when there is good regulation, it is often very poorly enforced? Is that another challenge here that we have to get past?
Yeah, I think it's the biggest challenge on the regulatory front. I think conceptualizing and setting forth the regulations, although a piece of work, I can see that, as I was just saying, I can really see how we do that. Enforcement is difficult, and it's difficult because it's global. On the other hand, we do have a lot of technology nowadays that we have not had in decades past. So for example, in China, we have a lot of automatic monitoring now of discharges and air pollution coming out of stacks. There's very interesting developments in satellite supervision of factories. And I think, again, where there's a will, there's a way. Won't be perfect. In some ways, I think it may even be easier for environment than for labor, because we have like physical things that machines can measure, whereas the labor enforcement might be more difficult. And I do hope that with regulation, there'll be a little bit technology forcing, so that we can continue to have more and more remote and automatic monitoring of environmental impacts.
Yes, and I think that technology piece is a really interesting aspect, because it does start to pierce the veil somewhat of the myth that companies have that they just can't, it's too complicated. They can't trace things back to where they came from. But actually, there is technology that can allow you to do it. And I think also what we're seeing over the course of the last year with some of the issues that are arising with cotton in China and real sanctions being put on that you've got a very tangible business risk if you don't start to solve that issue as well, which I think is adding pressure. We are at the very final minute of our conversation. I know there's always so much more to say, Linda, but I wonder if in closing, if there is one thing a company could do today to improve that track record on this, where should they start?
They should baseline their emissions in their supply chain. Forget about scope 1 and scope 2, by which I mean your offices and your retailer. It's just very small environmentally, and go right to your supply chain and go to the hot spots in your supply chain, not your tier 1. And just create for us in 6 or 9 months your estimated baseline and starting point, because then I'll think you're really in the game. If you're not doing that, you're just not in the game, because you just don't even know where your starting point is.
Right. So it's find the focus on the biggest issues to begin with, start there and build. And I think that's actually a great message for all of these topics that we're looking at today. Start with what you can, but build your ambition. Linda, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we'll be talking about this much more in the coming months. Stay tuned for our closing keynote with Stella McCartney coming right up.
Welcome back to the BoF Professional Summit, Closing Fashion Sustainability Gap. Over the last few hours, you've heard about an incredible range of challenges and an exciting array of opportunities that our industry faces. To close out today's event, we're delighted to have one of the industry's sustainability pioneers as our keynote speaker. Stella McCartney has spent her decades-long career grappling with these kinds of issues, constantly delving deeper into the challenges to find solutions while building a successful fashion business at the same time. In fact, this is the latest in a series of conversations that Stella and I have had over the years, going back way to 2015 when she was the cover star for our print edition called 7 Issues Facing Fashion Now. And of course, sustainability and workers' rights were two of the most critical conversations we were having even back then. Here's a little look back at Stella's career. Stella McCartney grew up as a vegetarian on an organic farm. She graduated from Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design in 1995, and shortly thereafter became the creative director of Chloe. After deciding to launch her own business in 2001, it was only natural that her brand would reflect her strong views on animal rights. So no leather, no fur, no skins, no feathers. At first, it was not clear how this would impact the brand or its business model. But over the years, as McCartney and her team learned more about fashion's impact on the planet and its resources, they broadened their vision, making Stella McCartney the fashion world's first luxury brand with sustainability at its heart. A few days ago, I sat down with Stella over Zoom to continue our conversations and talk about her recent work in regenerative agriculture, the business of sustainable design, and what the industry needs to do to begin moving towards achieving these critical targets before 2030. Stella.
Imran.
How are you, first of all?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
It's been a crazy year. I'm still trying to process everything that's happened, but we are here today to talk about sustainability. And this is actually the continuation of a conversation that you and I have been having for many, many years. We created the BoF Sustainability Index because we wanted to insert some real data, comparable data, to help us as an industry gauge and measure progress. Because of course, without data, we can't measure how things are changing. The index covers transparency, emissions, water and chemicals, materials, workers' rights, waste, things that you and I have spoken about over the years. And I was really interested to learn and read more about the work that you're doing in regenerative agriculture and regenerative farming. The magic solution for sustainability is not any single thing. And actually, one of the most important things to understand about our index is that everything intersects. All of these categories are intersectional. So while we've created them as separate elements of our index, they're all interlinked. So in the first instance, can you tell us, and explain to us what regenerative agriculture is and why it's so powerful and how it works?
We only came to this way of farming thousands of years ago because we actually even then didn't know how to farm, obviously. And we didn't know that when we took so much from the soil and over-farmed the land, that it would have nothing left to give us. But at that stage, we realized, and that was obviously we were nomadic and we moved on and we learned. Sadly, we're in a day and age where we have to learn again. So regenerative farming is a very simple way of basically giving back not dismantling a specific sublayer of the soil, because when you do so, you release harmful gases into the environment. It's also just about restoring soil and caring for it and looking at the entire community around the crop. You know, it's not just what you take out as far as the crop that you're receiving. It's also all of the space and land around that area. You know, really drawing down carbons from the atmosphere back into the soil. And so it's very simple, but today it seems very radical. And really, it could be the future, I think, of fashion.
I understand the concept of kind of farming the land in a way that doesn't strip the land of its nutrients, and, you know, combining different kinds of crops together and growing them in different ways so that together they aren't stripping or taking nutrients from the soil. They're kind of, you know, working together. But how does this all link to fashion?
We're an industry that takes from farming, that basically farms the land. Cotton is one of the most used, you know, materials. It uses a huge amount of land, a huge amount of water, a huge amount of chemicals and pesticides. Our industry is very, very linked in. We're one of the most harmful industries on the planet, sadly, to the environment. Really, where we really, you know, fall short of taking care of Mother Earth is in our you know, animal agriculture, how we farm animals. Basically, if we over farm the planet and just keep taking and raping her of all of everything she has to give us naturally, at some stage she's going to give up and say, I can't keep giving anymore. You need to give a little back. We're not doing that on the whole. We're taking you know, the food industry, you know, the fashion industry, and anyone that is cropping our land currently. And it's not just the crops that you would think of, cotton crops. It's a devastation. But also, you know, the wool industry is very, very harmful. Cashmere, very, very harmful. Not only obviously deeply cruel to the animals, and a very inhumane job to actually have as a human. These animal, you know, crops, if you like, are basically just grazing all day, and there's no nutrients going back in. The chemicals, the pesticides that are poured onto these, you know, onto the land is going into not only the animals, but obviously going into the soil. It's not something that people know about. You know, it's great to talk about it and to kind of, and there are solutions, you know, there are very exciting solutions out there to be had for our industry.
So talk to me a bit about those solutions. You've been working on projects related to both regenerative wool and regenerative cotton. How did those projects work, and what are the learnings you've had thus far?
We've been working with great partners, essentially, and that's what you sort of really have to do when you start looking at wool. And I don't think that at any stage during our conversation I should try and pretend that what I do at Stella McCartney, what we do as a company, is easy. You know, if it was easy, I think more people would join forces with me. You have to trust people, and that's really not an easy thing to do when you're talking about, you know, some of the kind of less trustworthy practices out there. We have worked with great partners in wool in Australia, and also we use regenerative cashmere. We use all of the waste on the floor. We pick up all of the waste and then we respin it, and then we work with that. It's a really interesting way of working because all of your fibers are shorter. So I can't create a sort of really dense cable sometimes. Sometimes I can't create the knitwear that maybe I would want to create. But that's a fascinating design kind of challenge that I find myself on a daily basis working in a more sustainable way. We have a lot of people tracing and policing, you know, the people that we're working with. And you have to find people that actually are like-minded and doing it for the right reasons. I think at the core of all of this, if our mentality shifts in the fashion industry, and we actually want to do this and want to have better practices in our industry, then I think it will get easier to work with people.
So when you say we work with regenerative cashmere, explain what that means exactly. You talked just now about using some of the discarded or unused, you know, waste, but explain to me what regenerative cashmere involves right from the very beginning as a kind of philosophy and operating model.
You're working already with better suppliers. And we, to be honest, we are minimalizing a lot of this in the company. We don't use any Angoras. We don't use any, yarns that really hurt or harm or kill animals, because at the end of the day, that's what we stand for first and foremost. It's taking waste. So you're using all of the off-cuttings on the factory floor that otherwise would just be thrown away. There's so many different aspects to the conversation. There's so many different angles. It's a supply chain conversation. It's over 60% of what we do in a positive way at Stella McCartney is working really, really, really strongly from the first moment with our suppliers and having conversations and telling them what we need if it doesn't exist and developing it with them so that we can have something that, is more sustainable, and they will also benefit and they will learn from the process.
You're also working on a regenerative cotton project, and cotton comes up a lot in the conversation around fashion just because it's such a thirsty crop. So how does regenerative cotton work?
It's obviously organic cotton, so there's no pesticides, no chemicals involved, which is not only better for the planet, but obviously it's much better for the people that have to work in the cotton fields, if you like. And I think that's something people have to be really realistic about. These crops don't just arrive in factories to get spun. It is really respecting the environment, the entire environment of the process. So you're not just plucking out a plant or picking the cotton. It's very much looking at soil, looking at growing organic matter, putting so many more nutrients back in than you're taking out. And as we spoke about earlier, really respecting the sub-level of soil that is, once it's disruptive, it can really, give off harmful gases into the environment.
So how long will it take for projects like this to achieve some kind of meaningful scale in the industry?
It took us over 3 years on our own, and we're still one of the only houses in the fashion industry to use a sustainable viscose source. It took us on our own about over 3 years to find a forest in Sweden that we could partner with to get the wood pulp. So it takes a long time to work this way because it takes a lot of commitment. We then invest in it and then we buy it, and we will only use that viscose for many years to come. So it's not as kind of, throwaway fashion. You have to commit. And, even when, for example, if I'm working on a winter show and I go, oh, I'd love Devore or I'd love a velvet, and my team look at me and they're like, well, you can't, it's viscose, and we haven't been able to weave that with our suppliers from our sustainable forest. So, it takes a long time. In answer to your question, more and more and more, the answer to all of these problems is you guys and people and like the consumer. I don't think we can rely on our industry to commit to this as much as we can rely on tomorrow's customers insisting that this is the only thing that they're going to, invest in, and they're not going to consume anything or compromise on anything, and it's their future. And so I think that it takes a long time, and it basically requires investment and commitment. And as the demand obviously grows for these things, hopefully the price points will get more in parallel with conventional materials, and they will become the future. And they're not there yet. They haven't been developed enough. Nobody's given it enough love and attention or importance to actually get it as good as the conventional one. And that for me is landfill too. If you create something that's sustainable, and it's not attractive and designed well and not desirable, then, in itself, you're kind of creating a nothing product.
So one of the themes that's continually come up in your responses has been the sacrifices that you're making as a designer. We were talking about how you're also now such an important advocate for this issue that you really pioneered in the luxury industry. And I think what's lost on people sometimes is that at your core, you're still a designer. And in order to be a sustainable designer, you are making creative sacrifices. You can't work with the longest fibers, you can't work with certain materials. Like, how does that impact your design process?
As a designer, and I am first and foremost a fashion designer, that's what I studied to do. Every single day, we are faced with a set of challenges because this is the way in which, you know, we choose to work at Stella McCartney. So we just had the winter 2021 show, and it was obviously we're PVC free, for example, at Stella McCartney. And I wanted to use sequins. And, you know, my team come in and they go, okay, well, here's your non-PVC sequins. And I've got like 2 booklets, maybe 1 scale and maybe 5 colors. And then I get a little angry. And I'm like, that's not fair. If I'm making the right choice, why am I being penalized as a creative? You're looking at far less qualities, far less weights, far less colorways, you know, but there's 70 billion barrels of oil that go into these virgin materials. And I'm so proud that we've not been part of, we've actually, our statistics now are getting so exciting that you know, the prevention that we've actually had over the last 20 years of working this way. One of the hardest things and the most unconventional things that we do obviously is not use leather. The fact that we're still alive as a business in luxury is a miracle for not using leather. And I think we all know we'd be 100 times bigger if we did. We've managed to work alongside our suppliers and say, you know, we need to be softer. What about this vegetable oil coating? What about this? Or what if I perforate it? What if I manipulate it? What if I put it on tulle? And we've gotten to a stage where I cannot believe now, the last few years, we've been able to make garments out of these, you know, faux leathers, which I tell you, when I first started out, I would never have imagined I could have done that. I'm working on spring now, and yesterday, we were talking about the tailoring, and, you know, we only will work with our partners on our wool sources, and you know, we have to weave those into our tailorings to years in advance. So you're also in danger of being really out of fashion, you know, because you have to, you know, normally our industry is like 6 months in advance, a year in advance. I've got to be like a couple of years in advance.
So Stella, what role does technology have to play in this, you know, fight against catastrophic climate change? We've talked about, you know, age-old techniques like regenerative agriculture, but what about technology?
You have these 2 spectrums, you have these 2 completely opposing elements that could be the, you know, the answer to it all. I've worked with so many different, you know, new tech companies, and every single day we meet more and more, and it just, it's so exciting. We work with a company called Bolt, who actually initially they were spinning spider silk in labs. They've been trying to grow fake leathers and things. There's another company called Modern Meadow. But there's amazing new technologies. We just, with the same company, Bolt Threads, they created Milo, and we've worked exclusively with them on launching these mycelium leathers, which are obviously a mushroom root system. If any of you have not seen Fantastic Fungi, you all have to watch it, and you'll understand what mycelium root systems are. We work tirelessly with companies called EcoNil, which is incredible. It's very much about using waste. You know, our biggest kind of demon in this conversation is the amount of waste that we generate in our industry. I'm actually running out of waste at Stella McCartney because I'm just using it all up in every collection, which I love. But sadly, there's over $500 billion worth of waste generated every year, which for me is a business opportunity. If anyone can figure out what to do with that waste, then that's going to be a great business. EcoNil, they're breaking down old cotton piece, old, you know, anything, any old secondhand product in a non-chemical way, and then making it back into the fiber, and we're respinning it, and it's completely circular. So we've had great fun working with them. We launched this incredible fake fur called Cobra, which is a biodegradable fur. Some people in the fur industry believe that it's a more natural product than a fake fur, which is just not true. It would be if there weren't a ton of chemicals put on it to stop it biodegrading naturally. But unfortunately, they put so many on them that it's very harmful. I think that at some stage we have to talk about animal rights, because that is the conversation that nobody really wants to have. And it's really the biggest harm on the planet. And I also believe that the human rights attached to that, I don't think anybody wants that job in the fur farm, right? And so I think we have to understand we're in a privileged position to talk about this. We are, anyone listening to this is already privileged beyond the people that are on below minimum wage having to work in fur farms or in leather farms. It's taking a long time, but I think most industries are struggling with sustainability. We know that in the fashion industry, we've been working with the same sort of 10 materials and 10 suppliers for hundreds of years. And it's hard to break those patterns, I think, and challenge those price points and challenge how easy that supply chain is. Nobody has really clear policies and deadlines and, and kind of, where are the kind of cutoffs in politics for any of these industries? I mean, fashion is one of the last, we're one of the worst to have any kind of rules and regulations placed on us, even in our packaging, even on how we power our headquarters, how we use energy in our industry. We found at Stella, it saves money. It not only saves water, electric, human welfare, it's money for businesses.
All of these efforts take time. It's been more than 20 years since you started your business and you started exploring and investigating all of these other ways of, designing, making, and creating fashion. We created the BoF Sustainability Index to measure progress, as I said earlier. And our conclusion is that the industry is just not moving quickly enough. If we look at the top 15 players in the industry, publicly traded companies across all the different categories, there's signs of progress. They're starting to, pay attention to these things. They're starting to make some commitments and set targets. But in terms of real action, it doesn't seem like the industry is moving fast enough. What's your take on the progress and speed of change?
If you look at other industries that are perhaps moving faster, it's because governments have put guidelines on them. If you look at electric cars, if they don't deliver on that deadline, they're going to sell less cars. So, it can be as simple as that, perhaps. If our industry just actually had the balls to say, by this date, you've got to stop using leather, it would have the biggest impact environmentally. It would have such a huge impact if we actually reduce the consumption of animals across the board. I mean, we all know that. And it's not a comfortable conversation for people to have, but it's the reality. I think that there has to be policy change. And we work with a great organization called NRCD, and we constantly do it where we set them challenges and we set them guidelines to reduce their water, to reduce, to work in a different way. And actually, it's been fascinating to see. And actually, it comes out that they want to continue to work in that way because they've saved money. But I think the only way truly to have significant change in the timeline that we have is for policies to be set into place, for there to be legislation, some form of incentive for companies. We can export a non-leather good into America and we can be charged up to 30% tax on that, purely because it's not made out of an animal skin. And you can put a slither of pig leather on it that's like an inch big, and you're exempt of the tax. You're actually told, really, you're not going to grow your business if you try to be, more mindful and a better business model in fashion. But I do know, we have COP26 coming up this year in Scotland, and we need the governments to really kind of look at the fashion industry. They've looked at the car industry, at automotive industry. They've had clear, rules and regulations, and therefore they're delivering on them in time with electric cars. There's more and more. And we know that's because they know they're not going to make money if they don't. And, our industry is no different. It's not like we're all good Samaritans. People are in this to grow their businesses. And I think they need to be told that they're not allowed to work in a certain way up to a certain point.
Speaking of making money, a couple of years, you took the industry by surprise when you joined LVMH after having left Kering. And one of the things that was underscored at the time of your joining LVMH was the role that you had to play there as an advocate. And now Mr. Arnault, who founded LVMH, the chairman and CEO, is one of the most successful businessmen in the world. He's built this, huge empire of, scores of brands. How do you think about your role within LVMH? And how does Mr. Arnault engage on these topics with you?
Well, it was one of the big deciding factors for me. As you know, I like to infiltrate from within. I think that I was successful in doing that, and I really enjoyed doing that with you know, Monsieur Pinault and in Caring, and I think we were successful together in that respect. It's going well. You know, the reality is with Monsieur Arnault is he would never have invested in a brand like mine if he didn't recognize that this was the future. And I think that you have to give him credit for that. You know, it's unheard of, really. It's not really, you know, it's not something that he's ever done before. And I think it gives off a huge message of positivity to our industry, that if he's willing to look at that and invest in that when he can buy pretty much everything, that the choices he's making are taking into account how the industry needs to change. And he's very interested in how he can be part of that change. And so we're working on it. You know, they've set up a really great internal team. They already had one, but they've really kind of upped their game. And we talk all the time, and it's great. We're trying to cross-pollinate, you know, and we have specific plans in place, specific projects that we're working on that are really exciting. And, you know, I think Antoine Arnault said that I was one of the few people that kind of tells his dad, talks straight to him. And I think, you know, sometimes maybe he doesn't like to hear what I have to say, but I don't think that he has blinkers on.
I wanted to conclude by asking you about young designers who are early in their careers in the fashion industry. You know, for designers who are just starting out, you know, how do you advise them to bring sustainable principles, sustainable thinking, sustainable design into their work, while also expressing themselves creatively?
I think first and foremost, they need to really believe in that. It has to be something that is really true to them and not like, oh, I should be doing this because this is what's expected of me, or this is going to be a good marketing thing. And if I just do it in a conventional way, I won't have a kind of tagline, or I won't have a line in an interview. I think you must go into this with true commitment and for the right reasons, and it can't be fake. So I think you have to really want it, and you have to see it as a hugely exciting challenge. I mean, for me, I work with so much technology at Stella McCartney, and like that is the sexiest, coolest side to fashion today. Be a fighter and fight for your right to get better incentives. You know, you have to come together, work as a community. You know, I know so many great little communities of designers that are sharing fabrics, swapping fabrics, working together. We're hugely competitive, but come together and that will help, because you have to lean in. One thing I really haven't had in this conversation is anyone else in the room with me to lean into, you know? So I think that is a really exciting way to start. But push governments, like, don't take no for an answer. I think get information. It's all about information. I'm learning something new every single day. You never stop learning when you work sustainably.
We hope that our sustainability index will be part of the information that our industry can use as we progress, hopefully, towards a change that we need to see in the industry. Stella, I'm always grateful to talk to you, and I'm really pleased that you were able to join us at the summit. And I look forward to seeing you in person sometime very soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, look, you know, credit to all of you guys, because this is the kind of stuff that will inspire the next generation. And absolutely transparency, you know, call us if you need anything. We're always willing to share everything that we know, and you know, good luck, kick ass.
We're doing our best. Thanks, Stella. Well, that brings us to the end of our BoF Professional Summit, Closing Fashion Sustainability Gap. Today, we've heard about the substantial and urgent challenges facing our industry, but also the opportunities and innovations that are already underway. We hope this leaves you optimistic and inspired that we can act and that we can find the solutions our industry and the planet needs. This event was a huge amount of work, and none of it would have been possible without the contributions of our speakers, who generously shared their time and insights. Thanks to each and every one of them for their contributions to today's event. And thanks also to our Sustainability Council, who have been an integral part of the creation of the Sustainability Index. We look forward to iterating and improving upon it in the future. And the BoF team has, as always, done an incredible job of bringing this event together, coordinating across multiple time zones to bring together our amazing lineup of speakers. And a special congratulations to our London editor, Sarah Kent, for spearheading our work in creating the BoF Sustainability Index. If you weren't able to catch everything today, all of the sessions will be available for on-demand viewing exclusively for BoF professional members at businessoffashion.com. We would really welcome your feedback on today's event and the index, and we'll be sending you a short survey to fill out tomorrow. So please take a few minutes to share your thoughts. In the meantime, we are also excited to announce our next BoF Professional Summit. What's a Store For? On June 30th. Now, this has been a surreal week in London as retail stores have reopened to huge crowds of shoppers after months and months of lockdowns. Visitors at UK retail destinations at 9 a.m. on Monday were up 218% over last week. At malls, traffic was up 340%. And similar surges are expected to follow in other parts of the world as the weather improves, vaccination numbers rise, lockdowns are eased, and consumer confidence grows. Join us on June 30th as we examine the role of physical stores in a post-pandemic world, together with our retail columnist, Doug Stevens. Until then, thank you and farewell from London.